Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by Sean Chapman
and Jonathan Lack.
We are here to step into the Grand Tour, the Grand Tour, the Grand Tour. That's right, we're stepping once more into the Grand Tour of anime. This week on the show, we are playing with time. We're going crazy, people. In honor of the show that we are talking about today, we are currently hurtling through space at near the speed of light to experience time dilation, because last week, for listeners at home, you listened to our episode on Asmangadao, but for us, in our time reference near the speed of light, we just did the 1969 episode of Dororo. So in honor of what we're watching today, this is what we've done. Either that or what we're covering today is only 6 episodes, so it's easy to record and put whenever we wanted. But either way, today we are talking about a truly fantastic OVA series. We're talking about the 6-part OVA, Gunbuster, or Topo Nerai, made by Studio Gainax and directed by one Anno Hideaki. But Jonathan, you were the one who decided to do Gunbuster for our Grand Tour of Anime. So why don't you tell listeners at home, why Gunbuster and why now?
Well, Sean, part of it is just Gunbuster is evergreen. I think we can talk about it whenever, for whatever reason. It is that kind of anime classic. I have a special connection to this one because I did teach it. I taught specifically the movie compilation version from 2006 that we'll talk about later for my Giant Robots on Screen class in the fall of 2021 at the University of Iowa. I had paired it with the Shinkai Makoto film Voices of a Distant Star, which I later wrote a Criterion essay on. So that one class period we've turned into a Criterion essay and a podcast, equally prestigious, I think. And it's just fun to get to talk about it. Obviously, the Voices of a Distant Star, I think, is at least mildly inspired by Gunbuster. Also uses the time dilation idea and some other sort of similar concepts. It's also very inspired by Macross, which Gunbuster is very inspired by Macross. Yep. So we'll get into all of that. But I've always wanted to do a podcast on this one, and I think, like I said, it's kind of evergreen. I've seen this OVA several times. I've seen the movie, I've seen the OVA at least 3 times. But I actually don't know. Had you seen this before, Sean?
No, this was my first time actually watching it. Obviously, Gunbuster is a thing I've known about forever because even in the West, because of its connection to Anno, obviously for Neon Genesis Evangelion, it's very, very famous. So I feel like I sort of knew most of the major parts. Like I knew that the last episode was in black and white. Like I knew it had all the time dilation stuff. I recognized basically every single character I've seen before and the Gunbuster itself, but I'd never actually sat down and properly watched through it. So this is my first time. And it's awesome. I don't think it's flawless. There are a couple of kind of issues I have with it here and there. And it made me have a revelation about some of my reaction to some Gainax stuff, including Eva, which I'll talk about later, about things I like about it, but also things I don't like about it. But I think there's no question that it is one of the most lavishly produced OVAs of the 80s I've ever seen. It is so gorgeous. And I do just kind of love its very kind of bizarre, frantic energy of taking all these different reference points, mashing it together, but doing a lot of very interesting, very kind of intricate things in the details and in individual scenes and episodes that I just think are very fascinating as someone who's a big fan of mecha stuff. There's just some material in here that I think is really, really exceptional.
Absolutely. It's, I think it's such an exciting work, and I think it remains exciting because it is so chameleonic. It starts out in episode 1 being a sports anime mixed with an 80s exercise tape mixed with, sort of your mecha bullshit mixed with Top Gun. And then it is like hard sci-fi in episode 2. And then it is like a sort of horror-tinged love story in episode 3. And then for the final 2, it is the birth of Anno Hideaki anime auteur, like very clearly, because that is where I think you just see his whole career kind of come into focus in those final 2 episodes. And so is it imperfect? Absolutely. It's kind of a wild protean sort of thing, but I think that also means that no matter how many times you see it, it's kind of exciting because it is so firing from the hip, unhinged otaku delight as a work. And I think that's part of what makes it, like, it's very endearing. It's very hard to watch this and not have a smile on your face because it is a work of such unbridled enthusiasm. Like, look, Ma, look what we're doing with our animation. There's that kind of feeling of, like, we're doing it. And this, everyone who worked on this was in their 20s. And this was, for many of them, their first, this was Anno's directorial debut. For a lot of the people involved, this is, like, their highest, creative position so far. And you can just feel the enthusiasm.
Absolutely. It makes, again, for an hour time frame reference in our time dilation situation we're in, it actually makes for a very interesting contrast with Dororo, because you're getting this, like, next generation of creators, right? Because, like, all the people who worked on Dororo, they grew up in a world where the anime, like, an otaku thing didn't exist as we understand it. And so, like, they're not necessarily coming into it influenced by previous anime, right? They're obviously influenced by things like Disney and some animated productions in Japan, but that's not what it is for Anno and this generation of creators with Gainax, who grew up with things like Space Battleship Yamato, grew up with things like Mobile Suit Gundam, and Ultraman and some of that other stuff from around that time period, not necessarily anime, but is the kind of like that birth of the original otaku generation in the 60s and early 70s. And so it's really interesting to see that contrast and the good and bad of that, because I do think there are some negatives to it in some places in Gunbuster where it gets a little bit too up its own ass about some of those kinds of things. But at the same time, the sort of really frantic energy it has can only be borne by someone who is so ridiculously obsessively nerdy about the details of all these different influences, whether they're anime or like science fiction or whatever it is.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm glad we are on the same page broadly because this is a fun show. It is not, Neon Genesis Evangelion is a prickly work that produces, I think, sometimes prickly responses from you and me, but I don't think you could call Gunbuster prickly. It is a big warm hug of a mecha anime, and I'm excited to talk about it. So do you want to dive into some history, Sean?
Yes, Jonathan. So since this is one of your choices for the season, you're in charge of the history section. So, and as I said, you've taught this damn thing before. So what are we talking about here with the history of Gunbuster?
Well, the history of Gunbuster is also the history of the person whose name is top of the credits. So let us tell the story of everyone's favorite mega nerd otaku / chronically depressed person / Ultraman fan turned anime auteur turned live action auteur turned star of Miyazaki Hayao's 2013 film The Wind Rises, the one, the only, Mr. Anno Hideaki. Obviously one of the most singular, unique, and interesting figures in the history of Japanese cinema. I love just trying to summarize his credits into a single sentence because it's insane. So we are not going to do justice to his full story today, obviously, but we can give you the basics, so let's do that. Anno was born in May 1960. He was raised in Ube City in Yamaguchi Prefecture, which had a strong industrial base at the time with many factories, which Anno has credited with some of his interest in mechanical creations. He was, as you might imagine, a very artsy, nerdy boy from a young age, fascinated by tokusatsu shows, anime, and manga. He read a lot of shoujo manga as well, which you can very much see in Gunbuster and some of his later work, which was maybe unusual for people in kind of his position at a time when, I think a lot of the anime otaku coming up were probably more on the shonen side of things. At his local high school in Ube, he was head of the art club, and he belonged to an amateur video production group where he directed his first short film in 1978, which would have been his final year of high school. That short film was called Nakamu Rider, which you might imagine was inspired to some degree by Kamen Rider, which he loves. It was produced for the school festival, and Anno later re-edited the film as an adult in 2005 so it could be screened at exhibits of his work in museums and at festivals, but it is not available online. I did look for it. You cannot find it. Letterboxd has a description saying it, quote, condenses Anno's favorite elements, makes full use of effects such as stop motion and film scratching, and the images that are spontaneously obviously and freely constructed solely by his senses, represents the starting point of Anno's special effects live-action films. So it sounds like he was on his bullshit from a very young age. Anno took a year off after high school from school due to graduating with poor grades, so he could not get into a university. He eventually enrolled at the Osaka University of the Arts. Their application was fully practical, so he didn't have to do any tests. He just had to show his kind of art acumen. And he says he prepared for the exam by studying, among other things, storyboards by Miyazaki Hayao, who you have to remember at that time would only have directed for television, and The Castle of Cagliostro would have been like the new thing. So I think that's interesting. He's already kind of obsessed with Miyazaki, who his career will shortly intersect with. At Osaka, he forms the Science Fiction Research Club alongside Yamaga Hiroyuki and Akai Takami. Yamaga would later be the Studio Gainax co-founder with Anno, or one of them, there were several, and Akai became a Gainax board member, although was not heavily involved, I think, in the Gainax productions that we kind of associate with that period. But together, those three created an animated opening for the Daikon 3 sci-fi convention in Osaka in 1981. This is a very famous part of the Gainax origin story, because this little opening, which you can go find online, was praised for its high production values. And the crew later expanded to about 12 people, which created Daikon Films to make a follow-up for the Daikon 4 convention 2 years later in 1983. Like I said, these short films, you can go find them online. They are not commercially available because they freely use a ton of licensed characters and mecha and monster designs. The Gundam is in there, Godzilla is in there. They use music from sources like Lupin the Third composer Ono Yuji, Dragon Quest composer Sugiyama Koichi, Rocky composer Bill Conti, and the Electric Light Orchestra. So all the most expensive music they could find. So very much like, Sean, you and I made movies in high school, and we used all the music on our hard drives, and I just like that is a fine tradition that people have been doing forever, of just making stuff that can never be shown commercially because they just used all their favorite music.
Yes, and this is before YouTube, where you also, there's no, where for you to show it to the world, but also nowhere for companies to hunt you down and copyright strike you and shit that for it.
But those shorts were a hit. They became something of a calling card in the industry and got Anno and friends their foot in the door at various places, including Studio Nue, which was then in production on a little show, you might have heard of it, called Super Dimension Fortress Macross. And I have to say, Sean, one of the surprises for me in going over my Gunbuster research again is I either had not known or I had forgotten how central Macross is to the Gainax origin story, because it's not obviously a Gainax production, but like everybody who formed Gainax later in some way intersected with Macross, and like Gunbuster is particularly touched by it for reasons we'll talk about. But Anno and several future members of the Gainax crew worked on the show. That show had a famously troubled production. It needed every animator it could find, and Anno's work on the series, he did a lot of key animation, was very well received by those around him, and the connections that he made at Nue, as I said, would echo throughout the future career. As we'll soon see, many of the people they brought on for Gunbuster are Macross vets. Around that same time, Anno also responded to an advertisement in Animage, which is a popular anime magazine, recruiting staff for Miyazaki Hayao's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which, as we talked about in our Lupin the Third season, was animated by the studio Topcraft, a unit quickly hurtling towards bankruptcy. So they also needed everyone they could get, and were, grabbing people like Anno who are like currently in school. So Anno moved to Tokyo to do key animation, including, and this is a famous part of his origin story, the giant warrior attack sequence in Nausicaa, which is an iconic scene. It's continually been praised by the film's producer, Suzuki Toshio, by Miyazaki Hayao himself, and Anno has always been, and I find this is just one of the things I love about him, he's always been a huge cheerleader for Nausicaa. The only audio commentary on any Studio Ghibli Blu-ray is him doing a solo audio commentary for Nausicaa, which they did port over for the G-Kids release of that film here, so you can actually see it with subtitles and everything, which is pretty cool. Of course, later on, he's the main character in The Wind Rises, and in 2012, Anno and Higuchi Shinji created the Giant God Warrior Appears in Tokyo short film, which in retrospect feels like a dry run for Shin Godzilla. It's basically using live-action footage and then a CGI version of the giant god monster from Nausicaa, and it's supposed to be sort of a Nausicaa prequel film, which tells you, A, how much Miyazaki genuinely likes Hideaki Anno, that he lets him play with the Nausicaa IP and stuff, that, like, he's in with the Ghibli guys. Have you ever seen this short, Sean?
Yes, yeah, it's awesome.
It's fucking incredible. Yeah. So, and very much like if you like Shin Godzilla, Shin Ultraman, Shin Kamen Rider, you should see that short film because it is 100% it's almost like a pilot film for those because it's like a 12-minute short that does a lot of the ideas there. So remember that Anno is technically a student during this entire time period, the period where he is helping animate one of the seminal anime of the 20th century, and arguably the most important and influential anime film made in Japan up to that point. I do think that is hilarious that he did those fucking Macross and Nausicaa as a student. That's crazy. Now, the downside of that is that he never went to class, and he stopped paying tuition. So they expelled him in his third year, because that's what happens if you stop going to class and don't pay your tuition. But honestly, probably getting to say, I worked on Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind is better than a degree. This is king shit. I love it.
Yes, I mean, obviously, it's at a certain point, why do you need to go to art school if you're already, like, you're having the career that you would expect someone to have if they're very talented and had been in the industry for, like, 10 years or something, you know?
Yes.
And he has it, and he's in his early 20s.
One of the first things Anno worked on after leaving the Osaka Art School was the Macross movie Do You Remember Love, which one day we will cover, and along with other Macross things on this show, because Do You Remember Love is one of the most lavishly, beautifully animated films of all time from any country. It's just incredible. So it had a really good staff. And following the success of the Daikon 4 animation in 1983, he and his group were able to incorporate as an actual company, as I mentioned earlier, Daikon Films, that was founded with only 20 million yen in funding. So very, modest opening sort of starting funds. But the studio later changed its name to Gainax in 1985 because it would be weird to keep their name based on a sci-fi convention they did not control or own the rights to. So probably good to give themselves their own name. And the first thing they did, kicking off a fine tradition at Gainax of going well above their means, they decided to go after making one of the most ambitious films in Japanese animation history, Royal Space Force: The Wings of Honiamise, written and directed by Yamagi, who we mentioned earlier, formed that sci-fi club with Anno and helped direct the first Daikon film. That film released in 1987 after a very long production that cost 800 million yen, an insane number for a new independent studio. You might recall from our Season 3 episodes on Lupin that the early Lupin the Third films, like Mystery of Mamo and Cagliostro, those were made in 78 and 79, and they set records at 500 million yen. This isn't even a decade later, and they're going to 800 million. It's insane. The film was very well received, particularly by other animators. Miyazaki publicly praised it. He doesn't do that often, among many others, but it was not a commercial success. It grossed about 347 million yen. I say not a commercial success. That's a respectable sum if they had spent a sane amount on the movie, right? But either way, it was a failure, which is one of several things Anno would later contribute to the depressive episode he experienced that eventually inspired Neon Genesis Evangelion. Have you ever seen the Royal Space Force film, Sean? Because I have not.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's a great movie. It also makes a lot of sense that Miyazaki would publicly praise it because it's got a lot of airplane stuff in it. The premise of the movie is it's like a sort of pseudo-fantasy world that's sort of like it's sort of a mix of like Cold War and early 20th century kind of technology. But the main character is part of this Royal Space Force, which is a space force that has not yet gone to space. And so they're made fun of by all the other branches of the military. And basically the main character becomes inspired to want to become the first astronaut. So it's like the story of them going to space for the first time, kind of planning this first space mission. But it's all contrasted with this kind of Cold War commentary about, as along with the actual real world space race, about the ways in which those kinds of scientific and humanitarian pursuits by the people who consider them to be scientific and humanitarian are used by the military industrial complex to advance the purposes of war. And so it's a very interesting, very thoughtful movie that, again, has a lot of really luxurious airplane animation. So Miyazaki was probably just like slobbering all over that. Maybe he liked the story too, I don't know. But that part I'm sure he fucking loved. But it is very much a movie that feels like it is made in what you'd think of like the Ghibli sort of format of movie. It more resembles artistically a kind of Ghibli film. It's paced more like one of those movies. So it's not surprising to me that it didn't hit like a huge success because it is not a big populist kind of thing. There's not a lot of big action in the movie. It's very kind of slow. It's very thoughtful. But it is not the kind of thing that, unless you've got like a really good like name behind it or like a marketing line you can kind of get or just hits at the right time, it's not the kind of movie that's going to be a huge, massive blockbuster hit.
Well, remember, Ghibli did not have huge, massive blockbuster hits until the 90s. Their 80s work is now considered classic, and Nausicaa did well enough to found the studio, but none of them were, at the moment of release, massive hits. So that kind of film took a little bit of time to catch on. That's interesting. Yeah, for some reason, I keep meaning to watch this film. I never have. We do not have a Blu-ray of it here in the US. There is one out of the UK from Anime Limited that I keep meaning to import because it would be very easy. It's not an expensive Blu-ray or anything. So one day I will do that, and maybe we'll do that in some other season of the podcast.
Yeah, I think you'd really like that movie, Jonathan.
I probably would. I didn't know it had that much plane stuff in it. And like Miyazaki, I like my plane stuff. So, we're simpatico on that. In any case, the movie did sadly underperform. They were out many hundreds of millions of yen, and so a lot was riding on whatever Gainax made next, and that knowledge did very much fuel the production of Gunbuster. So first off is just the choice to do an OVA. That is, I think, a savvy business move at the time, given where the industry was headed, as Gunbuster was able to ride the OVA wave that I think it would be fair to say is at its peak in the late 80s, early 90s, right? So this is
because it's motivated by the 80s bubble economy in Japan as part of what sort of makes the OVA thing viable, that you can spend this much money on the productions and sell them for so much. Yeah. Because it's also the dawn of that kind of premium home video release, Laserdisc is now a thing. So there's multiple formats you can release it on, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, the late 80s is absolutely where that is at its best in the era of OVAs.
So just doing an OVA at all, this is the right time to do it. Okada Toshio, who is another Gainax founder and a co-writer on Gunbuster, stated that the goal was to create a work that could sell 10,000 copies and satisfy those who pay 10,000 yen, which was the price of the initial release version. About $100 in US dollars, depending on when you're doing the exchange rate. So they actually exceeded those goals. Each volume of Gunbuster, there were 3 of them, had a budget of 25 million yen, pretty high, but they sold around 30,000 copies apiece. So incredibly strong return on investment. That kept Gainax afloat for a while. So to achieve this, though, Anno and Company did self-consciously load the series up with popular ideas. It's not to say that it was cynical. I think all the things that they are referencing are things they genuinely love, but it was also it was kind of the anti-Royal Space Force in some ways. It's okay, that was a passion project from the mind of Yamagi, who had, these interests. Let's go for something that all our otaku buddies will be into. One of those things, not an anime thing, but of huge influence, is the American blockbuster Top Gun, which is why it's called Tapu o Nerai. The exact spelling of Tapu is taken right from Top Gun, all of that. We'll talk about that more later. And they specifically hired the Macross character designer, Mikimoto Haruhiko, who is an important mangaka and illustrator and all sorts of things. But he had this more approachable sort of popular design aesthetic, because Royal Space Force was more heady, it's got more of realistic style. Gunbuster, via Mikimoto's influence, involves very bishoujo design elements, a la the Macross character Lin Minmei, who I think everyone, even if you haven't seen Macross, knows that character design. And that, of course, becomes very popular in anime of the 80s. We're doing Dirty Pair next week. We'll see more of that.
Yes.
So, and obviously this would become part of Gainax's overall sales strategy later on, kind of culminating in Neon Genesis Evangelion, which we've talked about before, because that helps create the moe reality we live in today. See the Haruhi Season 1 episode from Season 4 of Japanimation Station for the full moe talk from Sean.
Yes, but absolutely Gunbuster is in that, right? If you're trying to find... And I actually did this last night because I was just curious. If you try to find any figurines of the main heroine from Royal Space Force, who's this little kind of... I don't think she's literally a priestess, but she's sort of this very religious young girl who kind of influences the main character's life. But she has a very sort of plain design. I did find one figurine, but it was a homemade figurine that someone was selling on some Japanese website I'd never heard of. Whereas there is 30 years worth of figurines of the various main 3 girls of Gunbuster that they sold, at the time and have continued to sell up till today. So it's obviously there's a very clear commercial reason to move to that kind of character design. Although I don't know, on the cynical thing, I think that probably some people involved in it were very self-consciously doing that. I don't think everybody was. I don't think Anno was sitting there being we need to make the girls sexy because that will sell more. I think he wanted to make the girls sexy because he likes sexy girls. I think that's the real motivation there.
You think future cutie honey director Anno Hideaki likes his sexy girls? What are you saying, Sean?
Yes, well, it's also one of the advantages of the OVA format, and it's one of the things the OVA format is used for in the 80s, is to have more sexual content, right? So
Yes.
you can have nudity and more sexualized nudity. This is also obviously where like animated pornography in Japan comes into its own, which is part of what the OVA market is, or a sector of the OVA market is pornography as well. But obviously Gunbuster like notably has prominent nudity in multiple episodes. Episode 2 has like a full frontal nudity scene that lasts multiple minutes where one of the characters has like visible pubic hair. You know, like it is using that as part of its whole kind of aesthetic, but it's part of a market where that is a fairly common thing at this point by 1988.
Yes, and honestly, it's pretty tame compared to some things on that market because, like,
Sure.
there's no sex scenes. The nudity is, like, there's a male gaziness to it, but it's not, like, in sexual situations. Like, I don't think there's anything in here that would be inappropriate to, like, show to kids. It's just breasts and stuff. But, you know,
Yeah.
like...
But
yeah.
but it is leering, but not as extreme as like Gainax would get later on.
Yes.
That Gainax becomes fairly famous for this, even outside. Obviously, like EVA has its share of problems,
Yes.
but there's other stuff they do that's way more in that realm. And like making the boobs bounce and stuff like that, which is in Gunbuster, but it is not as extreme as that stuff would get when you get into the 90s.
Indeed. All right, so Gunbuster was a success that kept Gainax afloat for a bit. They followed it up with the infamous Otaku no Video in 1991, another very successful OVA that did just get a Blu-ray release from Anime Ego here in the US, which is nice because that's an important piece of anime history. And they made the TV series Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water, which aired on NHK for 39 episodes between 1990 and 1991. That was Anno's follow-up. He directed it. Higuchi Shinji came on to help direct the last core. The story concept was by Miyazaki Hayao, who kind of gave it away to Anno and the Gainax crew. But that show also turned out to be a commercial disaster for Gainax. They lost a lot of money on it, all of which, I think that combined with the Royal Space Force thing, sent Anno into this depressive period, which became his inspiration for Neon Genesis Evangelion, which they started production on like 94-ish. While that show had a chaotic and troubled production, it brought Gainax temporarily out of insolvency, obviously, because EVA was a huge hit, and it launched Anno's career into the stratosphere. But you know that already, so we can probably stop that story for now. I will say, though, that Gainax did not make it out of EVA unscathed. It's important to remember because EVA's success was so immense that it led to an audit by Japan's National Tax Agency, which found that Gainax had concealed over 1 billion yen of income. The president of Gainax, Sawamura Takeshi, and their accountant, Iwasaki Yoshikatsu, were arrested in 1999 for fraud. Anno and most of the other creatives at Gainax sort of left in the wake of all of that. Anno honestly had gone his own way already. After End of Evangelion, he goes to work in live-action cinema with the actually really interesting 1998 film Love and Pop. I just watched that recently for the first time, and if you want to know where all the crazy camera angles for him started that you see like come to fruition in Shin Ultraman, he's doing that too, because Love and Pop is one of the earliest like digital cinema movies made with like handheld camcorders, and he's putting those cameras everywhere. There's more upskirt shots in that movie than you'll ever see. There's downskirt shots. There's shots where the camera must be like squeezed in between a woman's thighs and pointing at the floor, and on the edge of the frame you're seeing her skirt. It's insane. Yeah.
Wow, yeah. You know, I mean, I'm not surprised. That sounds like a thing that Anno would do, you know, because that's the kind of shot you can get in anime very easily. You just have to draw it. It is funny to imagine having to ask an actress, it's like, hey, can you just squeeze this between your thighs as hard as you can? It's like, trust me, it's important for the story.
But anyway, Anno had a couple years there of doing different live-action things, but the gang from Gainax would get back together to form the non-fraudulent Studio Kara in the 2000s, where the rebuild of Evangelion films were produced, and the rest is history. One last note on Anno before we move on to other Gunbuster things. I think it's fascinating that even as his career was taking off, Anno was still a rabid fanboy. Mobile Suit Gundam Char's Counterattack is released the same year that Gunbuster's first set of episodes comes out. It's 1988. And in that same year, Anno published a fanzine, Char's Counterattack Friendship Club, which included contributions from a ton of artists, including Izubuchi Yutaka, who is the mecha designer of the new Gundam in Char's Counterattack, eventually one of the co-creators of Pat Labor, Mikimoto Haruhiko, the Macross and later Gunbuster character designer, Kitazumi Hiroyuki, the character designer and animation director on Char's Counterattack, Ikuhara Kunihiko, who would be the soon-to-be director of several seasons of Sailor Moon, and later Revolutionary Girl Utena, and Yuki Masami, who is the mangaka who co-created Patlabor, and even Studio Ghibli co-founder and producer Suzuki Toshio. It also featured a roundtable discussion between Anno, Oshi Mamoru, the Ghost in the Shell, and many other things, also Patlabor guy, and Tomino Yoshiyuki himself. So I just love the idea that while he is creating Gunbuster, he's creating a fanzine with all of these people who are either already giants of the industry or are about to be giants of the industry. He had a good eye for talent.
Yes. No, I mean, Anno cannot deny himself. You know,
No.
he is an otaku down to, like, the deepest elements of his DNA. That's what he has always been. It is what he always will be. Like, there's no escaping it.
You know, I do not know of any other auteurs who would interrupt the long in the making production of the remake of their most famous work to go off and make a Godzilla movie. But that is what Anno did, and that created one of his best movies ever. It's just insane. I think he's hilarious.
Well, you gotta love, that one of his first movies, the first movie he ever made as a student was a Kamen Rider thing, and then later, once he gets popular enough, it's like, well, fuck, I'm just gonna make an actual Kamen Rider movie. Like, no one can stop me. I can do it.
Indeed. So, getting back to Gunbuster itself, like most Anno Hideaki productions, the series has separate English and Japanese titles. It is both Gunbuster and Tapuo Nerai. It is not one or the other. Gunbuster appears in the Eyecatch, and they go, Gunbuster, which is very fun. And that's sort of like in Evangelion, the English episode title is at the Eyecatch point in every episode, you might remember. But the Japanese title in the opening is Tapuo Nerai, which means aim for the top. All of which I think points directly to what a weird singular blend of influences this series is, because this is a portmanteau of the classic tennis sports anime Aim for the Ace, or Eisu o Nerai from 1973, and the global Hollywood hit Top Gun from 1986. Top Gun was huge around the world, obviously, but it was also spectacularly big in Japan. It grossed 6.7 billion yen, and as of 2019 was the 100th highest grossing movie in Japanese history. It later would have been displaced from that list by none other than Top Gun Maverick in 2022, which more than doubled that gross at 13.8 billion yen. So the Japanese, they love their Top Gun. Everyone loves their Top Gun. It's a classic. It had a big cultural impact in Japan, as it did on the West, on things like fashion and music. See the entire character of Coach Ota for more. We'll get there in a minute.
Yes.
But the series obviously also takes inspiration from various mecha anime. I would say particularly Macross because of the people working on it, but it's also got a lot of super robot influences in it. But we could list those influences all day. It is such a unique hodgepodge from, like I said, 80s gymnastic training videos to sports anime. It ranges from very loose science fantasy in the way some of the robots and aliens work to very notably hard sci-fi with its Einsteinian, this autocorrected to Eisensteinian because Google Docs knows that I usually write about Eisenstein, but Einsteinian time dilation plot, which is inspired by the 1970 Joe Haldeman novel The Forever War, but very much anticipates 21st century sci-fi, which would get back to this in stuff like Christopher Nolan's Interstellar or Shinkai Makoto's Voices of a Distant Star. So, very interesting mix of influences. Gunbuster was, as we said, an OVA. It was released between 88 and 89, with the 6 episodes divided evenly across 3 volumes. One thing I noticed when I was researching is that when those volumes came out depends on what source you're looking at. For instance, even the English and Japanese Wikipedia pages completely disagree on that. But the most reliable source I think we have is probably the first promo for the series from July 1988, which you can see on the Discotheque Blu-ray. This was the promo announcing the series. It boasts, and I love the just balls on this, the greatest staff in Japanese animation history, staff unprecedented in the Japanese animation world, a collection of brilliance you've never seen before. All other anime, clear the way. And so that ad goes on to detail that the first 4 episodes and 2 volumes are coming out. It announces Volume 1 will be releasing on October 7th, 1988 on VHS for 10,800 yen. I was slightly confused at what this was because they list both VHS and stereo hi-fi. I think stereo hi-fi refers to a kind of VHS, but this is, the Japanese have always had very fancy equipment
Yes.
for their home video, so sometimes it's hard to know. But yeah, about 10,000 yen for the VHS. That volume would also release on VHD on October 21st for 6,800 yen, and on Laserdisc on October 25th for 7,800 yen. If you don't know what VHD is, don't worry, I had forgotten too. VHD was a Laserdisc competitor mostly sold within Japan. It was similar to Laserdisc in that it was an analog video disc, so it's not digital data, it's analog data, but unlike Laserdisc, the data was read with a physical stylus, and the discs were housed inside these thick plastic housings that could not be removed. You put the whole housing into the device, a little bit like large versions of PSP UMDs, if you're familiar with those. That format died in 1990, so this was near the end of its life.
Interesting. I'd never heard of VHD before. You know, now I want a VHD just to fucking look at it.
You should go look at like YouTube videos because they're funny. They're really big because like laser discs are the size of like actual like vinyl albums. It's like that but in a giant plastic housing. So it's really unwieldy, which is hilarious. But anyway, the second volume of Gunbuster was released on January 6th, 1989. You will often see that listed as late 80s or late 88, like December, but the ad says directly January 6th, so that's what I'm going to trust. And that was on VHS as well. The VMD hit January 21st and the Laserdisc January 25th. That volume was advertised in a November 1988 ad with the tagline, 10,000 parsecs from Earth. The greatest space battle in animation history will be unveiled. Powered by the youth of teenage girls, the ultimate weapon awakens. The second volume ends, as you can still see on the Blu-ray, with a next episode preview announcing the order for the final 2 episodes, but we are told they haven't been scripted yet, so we see some early concept drawings and storyboards along with the final 2 episode titles, and those episodes took a little longer to get done because Volume 3 comes out 7 months later on July 7th, 1989 for VHS, and then July 21st and July 25th for VHD and Laserdisc. The final volume was advertised in a 1989 ad as The Fate of Earth's People is on the Line, the greatest battle in the history of the universe. They've said that about every single volume. I'm starting to not believe them. A limited screening of the series did take place, so this would be its first theatrical debut, between June 10th and June 16th at the Theater Ikebukuro in Tokyo. Pre-orders of the final volume received a telephone card and a poster. Telephone cards, just go look it up. It's a thing. I don't want to date myself. I never used a telephone card. You never used a telephone card, but they were a thing once.
The one of the characters in the show says telephone card. I'm like, oh right, this is even though I don't know why they say it because while this is set in the 80s, it takes place or sorry, it was made in the 80s. It takes place in like 2021 or some shit.
Yes.
So I don't know why there's some like lady on the fucking airplane asking people for the telephone card, but.
Even fucking 2001: A Space Odyssey, for all it got right, still has payphones in it, Sean. So,
yes.
We cannot always anticipate the future. A soundtrack album also went on sale ahead of the third volume on June 7th. The soundtrack contained the opening, ending, and insert songs, the Tanaka Kohei score from the first 4 episodes, 2 radio dramas, and a track titled You Can Also Be the Sound Director, Aim for the Top Parade of Famous Lines, which was a collection of sound clips by the voice cast. I kind of want to find that original version of the album because that sounds delightful. A second soundtrack debuted in March 1990 with the remainder of Tanaka's score. It also had an image song called Tobe Gunbuster, obviously a reference to Tobe Gundam, the first Gundam opening, although despite the title, it does not really play on the Gundam opening musically. It is, however, sung by Mr. Yao Kazuki, who we will talk about later because he's in this, as one of the voices in episode 3, and his singing is delightful. It also had a radio drama and the symphonic suite Kokuyoshi Gunbuster, or Symphonic Poem Gunbuster. All right, so those are all the releases in Japan. While Gunbuster was long available in the US and very popular here, it actually was never dubbed into English due to the loss of the isolated music and sound effects track by Gainax, so there was no way to kind of pull the audio apart. However, Discotek finally overcame this issue, and they produced a new Blu-ray set for the North American market in 2021 that did include an English dub, newly produced over 30 years after the OVA's initial release. Not the longest time we've seen between an anime and its dub, because Lupin the Third Part 1 had a full 50-year gap, but that is still a very long time to go before making the dub. Diebuster, a sequel made without Anno's involvement, is produced in 2004. It is directed by Tsurumaki Kazuya, who is a name I think we all know. He's directing the new Gundam show. Tsurumaki was very much the kind of Gainax wunderkind. He was a little younger than everyone else. But his debut as a director was the Science Lessons shorts on the original Gunbuster. He was 22 at the time, and he wrote, storyboarded, directed, and I think maybe just animated them because they might just be solo works. But he also did some key animation for some of the episodes. His first big leadership role came in the subsequent production of Nadia, where he was the animation director. I have not seen Diebuster, Sean. Have you seen Diebuster?
No, I have not seen Diebuster.
I have never heard super good things about it. I'd be curious because Tsurumaki is a very talented person, so it might be interesting. But it does not get the same kind of like hype that Gunbuster does, I think it's safe to say.
Yeah.
So in 2006, compilation films of both Gunbuster and Diebuster are produced, both of which are directed by Tsurumaki from the original OVA material. They're each about 90 minutes, and they originally played as a double feature called Gunbuster vs. Diebuster. This version of Gunbuster, the compilation film, is what I screened for my students in my Giant Robots class. Due to time restrictions, it would take about 3 hours to play the full OVA, and we had 2.5 hours. So I did that movie, and I paired it with Shinkai Makoto's Voices of a Distant Star, which was a pretty cool double feature. I will say, if you've never seen the compilation film, it's not like essential viewing, but it is pretty good as these things go. I think it makes a very smart choice in that it just plays episodes 5 and 6 in their entirety, and it makes that the basis of the film. Those are the best parts of Gunbuster. That's, I think, kind of the show-stopping part of the series. And what they do with the first 4 episodes is condense those into about 40 minutes, which does some characters very dirty. Young Freud is almost entirely cut out of the movie, but there are smart cuts too. Like, I think the way it does episode 1 is pretty clever, where it builds up to Coach's big speech to Noriko, and then when she does the training montage, they make that the theme song, and they play the theme song over the training montage, run the titles, all of that stuff, and then they just don't do the second half of that episode where she has the rival character she fights. Episodes 2 and 3 are the most vestigial. Smith Torin is still in there, but that whole story is pretty severely cut down. They kind of rework it so that they're meeting on the train is when they first meet, for instance. And they take the opening of episode 2, which depicts the initial alien attack and the death of Noriko's father. They make that the opening of the movie as kind of like a cold open. And then we do get the big action centerpiece from episode 4. The movie is 96 minutes long. I think if it was allowed to be 2 hours, it could actually be pretty good because I think you could cut it all pretty well. But it's pretty good as it is. One thing that's interesting is that the movie frames the episode 6 content slightly differently. Episode 6 is not only in black and white, but it's in widescreen. And in its original OVA form, it's presented at about a ratio of 2.0 to 1. I'm eyeballing that, but I think I'm correct on that. And they open the matte, because it was animated mostly at full 4:3. There's a bunch of unfinished stuff on the edges of the frame, but it does exist at that form. And for the movie, they opened it up to 16:9, 178 to 1. And I think that makes sense in a theatrical context, because in that sense, the screen opens from 4:3 and then just expands left and right. If you kept it at 2.0, it would expand and shrink, so it would transform the shape too much. I showed this for my students in a movie theater setting, and that transition point where it just opens to 16:9 is pretty breathtaking. It got some gasps in the audience from my students, and it was pretty cool. And then in November 2020, the series did get a full theatrical release at 5 theaters in Japan, with the 6 full episodes screened across 2 parts. The series continued to prove popular as the screening sold out. In the opening weekend, 4,500 people attended. I think that event made, I read, 5 million yen overall, which is pretty good for a 1-week theatrical thing at 5 theaters. And that presentation was again shown in 2023 for the 35th anniversary of Gunbuster.
Yeah, and Gunbuster has just been like, a very successful property ever since, because it's featured in so many different things. It's been in a bunch of games, like either dedicated Gunbuster games, but Gunbuster's also a consistent appearance in the Super Robot Wars series that's been going forever. So yeah, Gunbuster has a very large sort of presence in that kind of, both obviously the kind of Gainax world, but also just the Super Robot world in general.
Then in terms of the staff, obviously our director is Anno Hideaki. We've already talked about him. He storyboarded the entire OVA with Higuchi Shinji, so those two storyboarded it together. And then Tsurumaki Kazuya, as I said, directed the science lesson shorts, which are sequenced in between the main episodes. This OVA had 3 writers, and the credits are a little confusing because they're not accurate to who actually wrote what. Okada Toshio wrote the first 2 episodes. He is credited as a writer on all 6, but in actuality, we know he only wrote the first 2. Then Yamaga Hiroyuki, who we talked earlier as the guy who directed Royal Space Force, one of the first guys to work with Anno, he wrote episodes 3 and 4, but his contribution is uncredited. And then Anno himself wrote episodes 5 and 6 and is credited. And then, of course, Tsurumaki, as we noted, wrote all the science shorts. Okada was a co-founder of Gainax. He is credited on all their early stuff, and he was their first CEO, but he stepped down in 1992 and effectively retired from anime. But he's had a really interesting career because he became a writer and academic. He's penned many, many books on anime and otaku culture, and he has taught at schools including the University of Tokyo and the Osaka University of the Arts, where all of the Gainax guys went as students. Gunbuster and Otaku no Video are his 2 writing credits at Gainax. And then Yamaga, we mentioned earlier, he wrote and directed Royal Space Force. After Gunbuster, one of the things he wrote is he went and wrote Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket, which is pretty cool. Obviously one of the great Gundam productions, so good on him for giving us that. Then over on music, we have the musician who never will stop showing up on Japanimation Station. It is the one, the only Tanaka Kohei, who has done so many things. You know, he's the composer for Mobile Fighter G Gundam, Gundam the 08th MS Team, Hyoka, Gravity Rush 1 and 2, 2 of the best video game scores ever. Pat Labor he did. He arranged the original Dragon Ball theme songs, Makufushigi Adventure, and Romantiku Agerio, and he has done 25 fucking years of One Piece. Dude's a legend, and the score for Gunbuster, perfect.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's like you can tell it's a Tanaka Kohei score. Yep. It carries a lot of like the instrumentation is so kind of like distinctly him. It definitely has shades of the Mobile Fighter G Gundam score. It's got shades of Pat Labor. It's got shades of Sakura Taisen as well, which is one of his other big ones, or Sakura Wars, the Sega Saturn, then later PlayStation franchise of Bishoujo dating sim game / mecha turn-based strategy game series that he also did the music for those. And there's like some elements of that's in here as well. It's very good.
Yes, absolutely. Then over on character design, we already mentioned him, Mikimoto Haruhiko. He's a prolific designer, illustrator, mangaka, especially in the 80s, which is kind of his period. He was the original designer on Super Dimension Fortress Macross, and he was animation director on Do You Remember Love, the movie. He was also the character designer for Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket, just mentioned that, but several people from Gunbuster went to do that one. And while Mikimoto does all the basic character designs, my sense looking at the credits is he was not day-to-day on Gunbuster, because the animation director of the show, Kubouka Toshiyuki, is credited for adapting those designs for animation. So I think Mikimoto gave them all the designs. His hand is very obvious, but then you had Kubouka doing the actual like day-to-day work with the characters. Over on mecha design, you have some real heavies working on this. First off, we've got Miyatake Kazutaka, who started out doing mecha designs on Space Battleship Yamato. Can't go back much further than that. He was one of the 2 lead mechanical designers on Macross and has worked on most of the subsequent Macross series. He worked with Tomino Yoshiyuki on Aura Battler Dunbine. We'll talk about that next season on the show. And he later did work on both Gundam Seed and Seed Destiny. The best tidbit about Miyatake, though, is that he created a design illustration for the Mobile Infantry Power Armor in the 1959 Starship Troopers novel, which was published in Japan in the 70s. Troopers was a really big influence on First Gundam, and that design was borrowed by Anno and friends for the Daikon 3 and 4 opening animations, so it kind of came full circle to bring him onto the staff for Gunbuster. Then you have Ohata Koichi, who is perhaps less well known, and he later transitioned mostly into directing, not designing, but he did do some design work on Char's Counterattack and on the Macross 2 OVA. And then we've got Maeda Mahiro, who is, of course, a legend. He started out his career doing in-betweens on Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind for Miyazaki. He also worked on Macross, both places where he and Anno would have crossed paths. He later did key animation for several Ghibli movies, including Laputa, Only Yesterday, and Porco Rosso. He did animation on the Daikon 4 short, and then he was a key creative figure on Royal Space Force. And then he is a key animator throughout Gunbuster, in addition to doing some of the mecha designs. For Neon Genesis Evangelion, the show, he actually was not that involved. He did design work on 2 of the Angels, a little bit of key animation. His big contribution to EVA is that he is a co-director on the 4 Rebirth movies, along with Tsurumaki Kazuya and Anno himself. He has stayed in Anno's orbit. He did designs and storyboards for Shin Godzilla and Ultraman and Kamen Rider. He later also did mecha designs for the Vision of Escaflowne, and he has done a bunch of overseas work, including key animation on the anime scene in Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill. He directed the second Renaissance segment in The Animatrix, and he did concept art and designs for Mad Max Fury Road. That's a hell of a career right there.
Yes, that is a very broad range of credits.
Indeed. Our art directors for Gunbuster are Sasaki Hiroshi and Kikuchi Masanori, both of whom did art on Royal Space Force, and then they would stay in this role for Nadia, Anno's follow-up. Kikuchi has had a super prolific career, sometimes as an art director, for instance on episode 2 of the Giant Robo OVA, but mostly in background art, where he's worked on a ton of stuff, including several Ghibli movies like Spirited Away. Then we have our chief animation director. I already mentioned him, Kuboka Toshiyuki. He was the chief animation director, did the animation direction on episodes 1 and 4 directly. Episodes 2 and 3 were headed by Moriyama Yuji, and 5 and 6 by Sadamoto Yoshiyuki, but of course Kuboka would have been involved in all of them. He also served in this role for Anno's follow-up, Nadia, but he did not continue on with Gainax past that point. He then went off to be the character designer and animation director for one of the most important OVAs of the 90s, the Giant Robo series, which kind of pushed the OVA series to kind of, or format to new limits, because that's almost like a series of films, I think it's more accurate to say.
Yes.
And then he is later well known for his designs and doing animation direction on the Lunar series of video games and character designs for the Idolmaster series. More recently, he directed the Berserk Golden Age arc film trilogy. So, you know, I don't know if this is the greatest staff in anime history, as the ad for the show boasted, but it is a very storied staff of people. Like, a lot of big names are there.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a shame for this one that we, again, in our time reference, we just watched the 1969 Dororo. That has a claim for one of the best anime staff ever,
Yes.
if you look at what they went on to do. But, you know, this ain't nothing to sneeze at, that's for sure. Though I do have to call you out, Jonathan, for not formatting Idolmaster correctly in your notes here, because you gotta have the I be lowercase, everything else be uppercase, and the A is an @ symbol. You gotta be proper with Idolmaster.
It is correct in my dissertation, just so you know. I was doing shorthand here, but Idolmaster does appear a couple of times, I think because I'm mentioning the KyoAni director who went on to be big with Idolmaster.
Yes.
I forget her name. But
Yeah,
she was one
Tako
of the people.
Noriko, yeah.
Yes. Oh, yeah, Cloud Lady. The lady with the crazy death clouds. Anyway, in terms of our musical choices, in addition to the score by Tanaka Kohei, we have an opening and ending theme and an insert song. The opening is Active Heart by Sakai Noriko. The visual opening sequence, like theme song, is only used in episodes 1, 2, and 3, but the song is used as the ending for episode 4, which is a really fun moment. Sakai Noriko also performed the ending, Try Again, which is only used in the first 3 episodes. And then we have the insert song, Tapuo Nerai, Fly High, composed by Tanaka Kohei, performed by Hidaka Noriko and Sakuma Rei, who are the voices of Kazumi and Noriko in the show. And I think that insert song is used in episodes 4 and 5, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that's right.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the songs. I like the opening quite a bit. It's very fun. It's like, I will say, I think Patlabor, its OVA one-upped what this one is trying to do with its opening song a couple years later, and I love that one. But I do like this opening. The ending doesn't do a ton for me. The insert song is fun. This is not the most spectacular part of the show, though.
Yeah, they sound like they're kind of like what you'd expect for this kind of like 80s OVA songs, particularly for like the tone of the series early on that is a little bit more sort of wacky. Obviously has lots of serious elements all throughout, other than like episode 1 is pretty wacky consistently. But, you know, it gets pretty serious as soon as you get to episode 2, but it has more of that aim for the ace elements to it, and that feels like that's the sort of like tone in which these are made. Particularly the ending, where the style of the ending resembles a little bit of, if you've ever seen like the manga art for Aim for the Ace, it kind of is a little, it's not exactly that style, but it's more in that style. I think it's kind of referencing a little bit of that look. But yes, it makes sense that kind of about halfway through they sort of go, I don't know if we need these anymore, because the series is pretty far gone away from the tonal space in which those made sense early on.
It also just adopts a much more cinematic affect with its pacing and everything. So, like, there isn't really because I also, doesn't it stop doing the eye catches as well? Like, it stops feeling like a TV show in the final couple of episodes.
Yes.
It's much more like a movie kind of in parts. So, we'll talk about that more in a bit. In terms of our cast, a lot of heavy hitters once again. Hidaka Noriko is voiced by Takaya... No, wait. Yes, no, Hidaka Noriko is the actress. Takaya Noriko is the character. It's confusing because they're both named Noriko, and I didn't realize that until looking at it right now. She is famous for a lot of different things, including Asakura Minami in the series Touch. In the same year as Gunbuster, she was Satsuki in My Neighbor Totoro, the older sister, so obviously big role there. And Noriko, the character, actually has posters of Totoro and Nausicaa on the walls of her apartment in episode 5, which I think is kind of funny because episodes 1 through 4 would have been made like contiguous with Totoro, so you wouldn't have been able to put a poster in them. But then this comes out a year later and they're like, let's put a Totoro poster in her room because now she's famous for this. And I think that's funny. She voices the character Jean-Roch Lartigue in Nadia's Secret of Blue Water in 1990 after Gunbuster. She is Akane in the original Ranma 1/2 and Sojiro Seta in Rurouni Kenshin. Great actress, great performance. It's good stuff.
Yes, it's very good. She, I think, particularly stands out in the last few episodes, like basically 4 on, where she's in all the action stuff. Like her performance in that stuff is killer. Like just when she has to scream like the big names of super moves and shit like that, and has to be very intense. Like she's so good at that stuff. In particular, I was very impressed by just how kind of ferocious the character sounds in those scenes.
Well, and she has to go between that and some pretty heavy emotional stuff that I think she's really good at selling as well. Like her big final speech to Kazumi at the end of episode 5 to get her out of her funk, all of that stuff. But speaking of Kazumi, or One-sama, as she's usually called in this series, that is Sakuma Rei, who has been in many cool things. She is Gigi in Kiki's Delivery Service, which is probably my favorite performance of hers. She's Batako in Anpan Man, and she is 2 Gundam women in 2 different Gundam shows. She is Nina Purpleton in Gundam 0083. We will not hold that against her. And she is Mirimaya Barton, or Marimaya Kushiranda in Gundam Wing, a character with a crazy double name.
Yes. That's the girl in the OVA ending stuff, right? Like she's like the little kid girl.
Possibly. I looked it up and I couldn't quite remember who she was. But I
think she's in the Endless Wing. I think that's what that character is, if I remember.
All right.
I think she's like the bad guy of that OVA. Yes.
That sounds right. Who she is. Yes, okay. But anyway, that is a better...
She's Treze's little sister. That's who that character is.
That's who that is. Okay. Gundam, look, we've watched a lot of Gundam. Gundam Wing was a while ago, but she is in that one and is a better part than Nina Purpleton. All right. Then we've got an actor who needs no fucking introduction, Wakamoto Norio as Coach Ota. He is, of course, Cell in Dragon Ball. He's Vicious in Cowboy Bebop, both vocally and he's the character Vicious. He's Gambino, Guts' adoptive, abusive dad in Berserk 97, which is a 1-episode performance, but we're going to see it soon, and it's a very good 1-episode performance. He is Chio Father in Azumanga Daioh, who we had a great time talking about his role as Chio Father in Azumanga Daioh. I really love that segment of our podcast.
I love that you don't know what that character is yet, and and everyone listening at home knows exactly what that character is, and I love that you put that credit in here because it's an important role in the history of Wakamoto Norio.
Okay, and I did not realize this, Sean. He is, and this is just a great little Wakamoto credit, he is the recast voice of Gene, the person who kicks off the entire action of the series in the movie version of Mobile Suit Gundam. He's not Gene in episode 1 of Mobile Suit Gundam, the TV show, but in movie 1 from 1981, he is Gene, and Gene is the person who opens fire on Side 7 and doesn't listen to his commanding officer and goes out by Amuro's hand at the end of the first episode. So I did not realize that was Wakamoto Norio, but it is. And this is one of his most iconic and famous performances, and for good reason. Coach rocks. He's perfect. I love him.
Yes, I mean, it's a great Wakamoto performance, and it's fun to get this, like, 80s era Wakamoto, because he's obviously very, very famous for having... He's, like, kind of like the Christopher Walken of anime. You know, he's got this, like, incredibly distinctive, really weird voice that has just, like, these absolutely bizarre kind of intonation things that he does. That's also just how he talks. Like, if you see interviews with him, like, this just, like, he is that guy. But he rolls his R's in these very sort of, like, incredibly flamboyant ways and stuff like that. But he gets more extreme at it as he ages. So when you're watching something from the 80s, it's like you're getting a taste of it, but it's kind of like if you're watching, like, Al Pacino in The Godfather versus Al Pacino in Heat, you know?
Yes.
Like, where the eccentricities, there's a little bit of it there, but it's a very subdued performance in The Godfather. Then you get to Heat, and Al Pacino's just, like, fucking lost his goddamn mind, but it's amazing. And that's what Wakamoto Norio is. If you watch anything today, like, if you play a modern Dragon Ball game and hear his modern version of the Cell voice, it's fucking great, but it's so fucking over the top. So it is fun to do this. But one thing that's fun is that you have the 2 extra science lessons, the 5 and 6, that those were recorded in the 90s because they went back and did it for one of the compilations where they put all of it together into one release. And so if you hear his coach voice in that, you can hear way more of the Wakamoto Norio-isms in his voice are way more prominent. And it's so funny to see that just in this like 1-6-year span, like how much he kind of went down this particular path in his style.
It's great because if you're watching all the episodes in order, Coach is not in episode 6 because he has died in that 15-year interim period. But then you have about a half hour with no Wakamoto Norio, and then you get the final science lessons, and he like jumps into the screen just screaming, and I wanted to stand up and cheer. I'm like, Coach, yeah! And he's great in those final 2 science lessons because it's already an exaggerated, chibi version of Coach, but it's very fun.
Yes. One other fun little trivia for Coach is that the way you say Coach in Japanese, obviously, which is what the characters call him, is Koichi, but his given name he's Ota Koichi. So if you say Koichi Koichi, it is like, it's a whole thing. But when I realized that and I looked, I was like, oh, that's okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Coach Koichi is fucking great. It's so. And the other actors, I think, have a lot of fun with that as well when they do that. But it's great. Here's a fun story from when I taught Gunbuster, Sean, is at the time I taught Gunbuster, this was in the middle of, well, it was not in the middle of, we'd had vaccines at this point, but the pandemic had come and started. And so we were still masking a lot. In schools. And in that period, I started wearing contacts for a while because I find it very hard to wear a face mask and my glasses. I know people like, oh, you just wear the glasses on the bridge and then they don't fall. No, that doesn't work for me. So I was wearing contacts, which meant I could buy sunglasses for the first time in my life, like normal sunglasses. So I did buy a pair of aviator sunglasses at that point because I'd always wanted to wear aviators. Joe Biden had just been inaugurated too. It was a different time. And, but I did, after we screened Gunbuster, I did get up on the stage to talk to the students, and I did pull out my aviators and wore them for about 15 minutes. I could see absolutely nothing, but it was very funny to try to do that. I did eventually have to pull them off because I could not see the students.
Did you just lecture at them for 15 minutes about guts and hard work?
Pretty much, yeah.
Leave it at that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Indeed. All right, as the spectacularly named Young Freud... time out for a second. Sean, how is Young Freud the name of a character in Gunbuster, but not in Neon Genesis Evangelion?
Because Gunbuster is better than the TV version of Neon Genesis Evangelion. It's more honest with itself.
Yes, it's 100% true. But anyway, it's just, maybe it would be too much of a hat on a hat on a hat if Eva had a character named Young Freud. Whereas Gunbuster isn't really that Freudian, so you can get away with it and just have fun. But anyway, Young Freud is voiced by Kawamura Maria, who is such a cool actress. She's had such an interesting career. Things you would know her from, I'm just going to list a bunch of Tomino shows. Cham Phao in Ara Battler Dunbine, Lilith Fra and Gaha Lessie in Heavy Metal L Game. I'm excited for that show because of the names. Bill Torchica in Zeta Gundam, that's Amuro's love interest. Quess in Gundam Char's Counterattack. Higgins Saz in Brain Powered, fucking hell yeah. And she is really important to the history of anime because Kawamura Maria notably read the new anime era declaration at the February 22nd, 1981 rally for Mobile Suit Gundam alongside Nagano Mamoru. Now, I have a whole paragraph in my dissertation. I have a whole section in my dissertation about this event. You translated the new anime declaration for us for that, and it was really cool. But I have a whole paragraph just about the weird history of Kawamura and Nagano doing this together in 81 and then the careers they went on to have, because they're just fans in 81. Mm-hmm. But Nagano then goes on to be a designer on Zeta Gundam and Heavy Metal L-Gaim, and he becomes the author of the 5-Star Stories, which is this seminal manga that Sunrise does a movie of. And then Kawamura becomes a famous singer and voice actor. In 1991, they got married, and Tomino Yoshiyuki and his wife were the official matchmakers. And, this whole event is important to Anno Hideaki because the phrase phrase Shinseki it's the Shinseki, declaration of Shinseki anime, right? For the declaration. And that phrase, like, why is that phrase in the title of Neon Genesis Evangelion, Shinseki Evangelion? It's because of that statement, and Anno is a fan of these things and knows all of this. And Kawamura is in every Tomino thing, and so, of course, he put her in Gunbuster, and I just love that.
Yes, that it is a weird, complicated web.
Yes.
But it's great.
Yeah. Then we've got our boy Yao Kazuki as Smith Torin. He is Judo Ashta in Gundam Double Zeta. He's Frankie in One Piece. He's Arbor Lint in Gundam 00. I don't remember who that was, but we did talk about Gundam 00, so I thought I'd list it. And, I mean, he's Yao Kazuki. He's in everything. We're recording this just in December after we learned that he is retiring from most of his voice acting for health issues. He stepped down from One Piece. We don't yet know who's replacing him as Frankie. So I was a little melancholy hearing him again in this because I love Yao so much. And he's very good in this. It's only one episode, but, I always treasure when we get to hear him.
Yeah, he's great in this. He's always great. And yeah, as you say, he's retired from almost every role. I know he's also stepped down from judo because there was some like Gundam mobile game or something that had some stuff, and he was not in that. They had a different guy who was very good based on the clip I heard as judo. But yes, it's kind of sad. But obviously, we're at that point where a lot of these people, they're getting old enough that it makes sense. But it is fun to hear him in his prime in the 80s. I mean, the character sounds exactly like judo. And it's great. Like, it's just this guy. He's just got such a great quality to his voice that fits that sort of character perfectly.
Honestly, if we're talking about anime actors and comparing them to Hollywood stars, I think Al Pacino is the exact right comparison for Wakamoto Norio, and I would actually say Yao Kazuki is closer to Christopher Walken, where if you go back far enough, he sounds like a human being, but then if you get to the 2000s, he sounds like, Yao Kazuki, and he only sounds like that. And that is a very, because he also just has a very unique way of saying things, which was very important for Frankie on One Piece, obviously. All right, and then finally, in terms of actors I wanted to list, we have the character Higuchi Kimiko, who is Noriko's friend back on Earth, and she's voiced by two different actresses. Fuchizaki Yuriko voices her in episode 1, and then in a brief clip in episode 6 when she's got a letter from her. And then Katsuki Misako voices the adult version in episodes 5 and 6. Fuchizaki is in many things. She was Ibuki in Meisan Ikoku, Lee Koran in Sakura Wars, Anthe in Revolutionary Girl Utena, and Katsuki is also big in this period of anime because she is Reko Alande in Zeta Gundam, as well as Tsunade in Naruto. I don't know if that's an important character or not, and Sailor Neptune in Sailor Moon. I'm fairly confident that is an important character.
Let me tell you one thing about Tsunade, and this will tell you whether or not she's an important character. She's the fourth Hokage. Or no, sorry, she's the fifth Hokage. I always get it mixed up because the fourth Hokage dies, and so they go back to the third Hokage for a while. So even though she's replacing the third Hokage, she's technically the fifth Hokage.
Oh, so it's like a Donald Trump situation, 45th and 47th president?
Yes, only if Joe Biden had sacrificed his life to seal the nine-tailed fox in his infant son, then it would be exactly like that.
Oh, politics is fun.
Maybe we're going to learn something fucking nutso about Hunter Biden in a few years. Who knows? Like, maybe he is more like the fourth Hokage than we know.
All right. Sean, that is the history section. Those are our actors. These are our heroes. You want to talk about the actual substance of Gunbuster, Aim for the Top?
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can also find us over at the Purely Academic Podcast, our potentially educational variety show where we talk video games, movies, TV, and more every month. And you can read my movie reviews and follow everything we release together on the Fade to Lack Substack at www.jonathanlack.com.
And now, back to the show. Yes, let's talk about some fucking Gunbuster, because this is a weird-ass show.
Such a weird show.
It being this kind of 6-part OVA that very much evolves throughout its life, it's very fascinating, because then it is also, pulling on just a weird, absolute fucking smorgasbord of reference points, anime and otherwise, that it is just sort of like chewing through, because you start with episode 1, and episode 1 is, even though I have not seen Aim for the Ace, so I do not know a lot about Aim for the Ace, if you know a little bit about Aim for the Ace, it is clear how much it's pulling from it. In the same way that if, like, you watched the first episode of, like, The Witch from Mercury, and even if you have not seen Revolutionary Girl Utena, if you just know vaguely about it, you're like, oh, this is all the Utena stuff. I mean, it's you watch the first episode, it's all the Aim for the Ace stuff. It's here's this girl who, it seems like she's just terrible at, in this case, being a mech pilot, in Aim for the Ace, obviously being a tennis player, and there's this beautiful One-sama character that she's absolutely kind of infatuated with, who's just like the best player at the school, and then this mysterious coach who's all about guts and hard work and grit and, stick-to-itiveness and all that kind of stuff shows up, and he sees something in our protagonist that nobody else can see, and so pairs her and the One-sama character up together, despite the protestations of all the other girls at the school. Like, that's just the premise of Aim for the Ace, and that is what this first episode is, but it is very weird what the thing it is also like, and there's these giant aliens that have seemingly killed her dad, and they're all training to be pilots to go to some sort of, like, unseen, far-off war against the bugs. Like, it is weirdly reminiscent of the premise of fucking Ender's Game in a weird way that it also made me think of, particularly these early episodes. It's like such a strange thing to mash this sports anime all-girls school parody thing, because you also have the whole plot about here's the other girl who's jealous and they're bullying her, right? Which that's an Aim for the Ace thing, I'm sure, but that's also like all of those kind of 70s era kind of, whether it's sports or not, kind of like pseudo proto Yuri manga kind of thing that have this whole framework. Like, it's just so common, but it's very weird to see that mashed with, and then they get into a big robots and fight each other. It is very strange.
But, like, that's the magic of it to me. I think the thing I love most about Gunbuster is the black and white in episode 6. But the thing I love second most about Gunbuster is that transformation. That you start with this. That you start with episode 1, where one of my favorite things in the world is just watching all the fucking mech suits do push-ups and do laps, and there's a shot of them, like, balancing on one leg, and all these absolutely ridiculous things that it makes. There is no possible explanation for why that is a helpful thing to be doing with mech suits. It's just there because it is a funny illustration of, like, mix your tennis anime with your mecha anime. It's ridiculous. There's that shot that is in our theme song at Japanimation Station, because I love it so much, of Noriko in her gun. It's not a Gunbuster yet. What's her initial mecha called? The, like, NX1
it's like
or something?
The RX-7, because it's obviously an RX-78 reference for Gundam.
But anyway, her initial suit, and she's running along the beach shadow boxing while Ota is on the motorcycle next to her, is genuinely one of my favorite shots in anime. It is so stupid, and I love it to death. And I love that you move from this episode with the rivalries and her wanting to live up to One-sama and all of that to episode 6, where now we're in black and white, we're in widescreen, we're going to detonate the fucking galaxy. And One-sama is now 15 years older. She's been married to Coach. Coach is dead. They're dealing with, like, very adult things at this point. Like, I think that transformation from that to, like, a pretty heady, weird, hard sci-fi thing that is completely ridiculous at the end, that's Gunbuster to me, like, in a nutshell. And along the way, this show is effectively Anno and Company doing, like, their sort of video essay on the history of anime, or at least the anime they have watched and loved from the 70s to now. And I think that is the thing that makes it so fun, is whether you watch this in multiple sittings or you just sit down and do it in 3 hours, it is this true journey that feels like you get to the end and you're like, I know logically that was only 6 episodes. It's weird that was only 6 episodes, because so much, like, changes over the course of these 6 episodes.
No, absolutely. And the way I watched it was in 2-episode chunks, because one, that's how I normally watch things for the podcast, because it feels like a good pace for anime. But I wanted to deliberately do it because I knew that that's how they were sold. And it is like an interesting way to chunk it up, because it does feel deliberate, but it is also very transformative within those 2-episode gaps, right? It's not like volume 1 and 2 are one thing, 3 and 4 are one thing, 5 and 6 are a different thing. It is very much like each episode on its own is a big jump tonally, stylistically, in terms of, like, narrative structure and content from the previous episode. Like, every single episode is vastly different from the one that preceded it. And that's one of the things that does make it very fascinating, because no episode goes back to what episode 1 is doing. There are elements of what episode 1 is doing that permeate the whole show, with the One-sama thing, with Coach. Like, those characters are kind of inextricably tied to that archetype from Aim for the Ace and other series similar to it.
Noriko is dressed to the very end in her, like, gym attire from
Yes.
episode 1 with, like, the headband and everything.
Yeah, but the actual story that's being told with those characters in the kind of space, the narrative space in which they exist, dramatically changes every single episode from one to the other.
Yes. And, you know, and it's also, like, weirdly structured in that the last 3 episodes all have, like, the climax of the series in them, you know, episode. Because one thing, I mean, clearly they made the first 4 hoping they would probably make more, but episode 4 is made in such a way that if this had not sold well, they could have ended the series there, and it has a big finale feeling. But then they kind of have to restart the story in 5 and 6, and I actually think that's part of why, excuse me, part of why I think 5 and 6 are so compelling is they have to do this thing of, like, we had the climax, what story do we tell now? How do we keep it going? What's the next thing to do? And so it is just this continual, perpetual transformation until, like, I mean, God, it is so funny to just make the juxtaposition that you start with, you know, Noriko worried about, you know, her One-sama noticing her in episode 1, to in episode 6, she and her One-sama are back on Earth in the year 14,000. It's just, you know, it's completely ridiculous. But I agree with you on that it's very different from episode to episode. Like, and I just remember seeing it for the first time when you go from what episode 1 is to episode 2, which is where they seed the whole time dilation thing, and being like, I was very shocked that that was a plot element in this, because episode 1 gives you no indication that we're worried about Einsteinian relativity, right? You would not get that out of episode 1 of Aim for the Ace, or Aim for the Top, or Aim for the Ace, probably. I haven't seen it. We're waiting for the
Unless they hit those tennis
season.
Balls very, very, very fast, then it might come up.
Okay. Well, if they were playing tennis with the Gunbuster, that would be... How is that not a thing? That just now that I'm thinking about it, how is that not a thing anywhere in here? Anyway, but you get that in episode 2 where it becomes about them chasing down this ship and they wind up missing it by 12 seconds. And so now they're 6 months ahead of everybody and they miss young Freud's birthday party. And then episode 3 is half this kind of like first love story, but it's also horror. Like it's the way it is done with her battle in that one where Smith flies off. It's a really unusual depiction of a space battle in that you're just with Noriko and she can't see anything. And I just think that progression is part of what is so keeping you on your toes and is so much fun.
Absolutely. And a big part of it is it's the production value here. It's like this is definitely a show that you know, it's sort of, you know, if you want to take a critical stance on it, it has a little bit of a style over substance quality to it, but it's that thing of where like the style is the substance, you know?
Yes, it is.
Where like, I think I struggle, this is one of maybe my criticisms with the show. We'll talk about it in like, so I have some problems with the ending of it. If I kind of struggle to make kind of narrative sense of it in the sense of like, it's hard for me to kind of pull like a bigger symbolic, metaphoric meaning that feels like it kind of moves me in any way with the story. Gunbuster does not do that at all. But it is just such a sort of virtuosic production in the details, in how it composes scenes, how those scenes are both how they're like storyboarded and directed, but then also how they're come to life through the animation. Like both of those things are so at the top of their game, you know. And again, in our time frame, we were talking about Dodo stuff a week ago. That's a show that has the most minimal animation it can possibly get away with, but some of the best storyboard artists and directors that the anime industry has ever seen in their kind of like you know, early stages. Here, it's like we get some, like, you know, Anno is obviously one of the other most virtuosic anime directors of all time. Higuchi Shinji also, in terms of storyboard artist and animator, one of, like, the best we've ever seen. But they also have this incredible budget of the 1980s bubble era behind it. And so the ways in which their stylistic flourishes, which are very extreme, some of them are quite experimental and are quite kind of, like, formal in how they're conceptualizing sequences and then exploring them, like that stuff is so good, and the Discotheque Blu-ray looks so fucking good. That just purely as like an aesthetic journey on that level alone, and just like the sense of pacing and that like how that's put together, that is so exceptional. It really blew me out of the water.
Oh, 100%. And yeah, the hats off to Discotheque, by the way, for that Blu-ray they put out in 2021. You can still get very easily. It's incredible. It's the same Blu-ray masters from whatever came out in Japan for much cheaper here on our side of the pond.
Yes.
But it is encoded really, really well because it It is to me like the platonic ideal of how to restore a series from this period, in that they have kept the grain intact, they've gotten the colors right, it just kind of looks like a film projection of the show, and it is gorgeous, but that also means it's a tricky show, I think, to encode correctly, because it's very grainy. And that means you need a higher bit rate. You need to be maximizing that as much as you can. But the Discotek Blu-ray looks just fucking fantastic. It's also got the alternate open matte version of episode 6, which is not the way you would want to watch it in terms of framing, but it is really cool if you're into the animation to see how did they pull this off? How were they framing it? What were they thinking? It's a really cool like comparison to do. So yeah, it's one of, you know, if you care about Japanese animation or animation in general, Gunbuster is a must-watch, whether or not you care about giant robots or sexy girls or tennis. Like, it is just, it looks so good, and it is so well-directed. And when you get into the space stuff with all the aliens in episodes 4, 5, and 6, and they're doing things like throwing out, like, there's 20 billion aliens. That's not me exaggerating. That's what they say in the show. Like, it's like it stretches 80 astronomical units wide or something like that, which in AU, if you don't know, is the distance between Earth and the sun. So it's 20 times or 80 times that, full of aliens. And you're thinking, man, they're saying some ridiculous things. And then they'll show a wide shot of, like, all the aliens. And I know there aren't, like, 20 billion aliens on screen, but it looks close enough that I just buy it, because they have done such detailed backgrounds, and in some cases not just the backgrounds but the foregrounds, what is in the cell layer. And then of course you get to the black and white episode, and I think if I'm listing my 10 favorite episodes of anime purely on aesthetics, that's in there easily. I think the finale of Gunbuster with the widescreen compositions and the black and white art is one of the most stunning things I've ever seen. I remember seeing it for the first time and not knowing that the screen was going to open up, and when it does, it's like when Dorothy walks into Oz and it turns into color, although it's kind of in reverse. But the black and white, I think, is so stunning. I think it is so well used. It's got this high contrast look where it does the thing that black and white does really well, where black and white favors textures over shade. And so you see, like, if they're drawing a sky full of tons of stars and full of aliens and all these things, it is just the density of it, like, assaults you in your eyes, and it's really mind-blowing. And I think it gives it this abstract quality. There's the whole sequence in the middle that is very clearly a nod to, I think, earlier eras of limited animation, where they do a whole action sequence through still drawings. But it's not just still drawings, it's sketches, it's graphite on paper. And, like, all of that, I think that episode is just unbelievably virtuosic on the level of production, and moves me every time I see it, because I think it is such a cool thing that they did and pulled off, and is, like, more fuel to my fire of, I want to see more black and white anime someday, because I think it's a cool thing to be able to do. But every episode, though, is amazing in some degree, and they're all doing very different things. So the fact that the visuals are that good every single time just speaks to what a great crew of artists and the big pile of money they had from the Japanese bubble behind them for this.
Yes, and I think for me, my favorite episode is actually episode 3, because I think there's something about that, particularly, like, as, you know, a mecha fan, you know, we've seen so many versions of the, like, this is the main pilot's first sortie, like, first proper sortie against the bad guys. Obviously, every mecha series has to do some version of that. And this is the most interesting version of that I've seen. Obviously, it has to kind of be built on the backs of all those other moments that they're kind of, like, looking at. But it's one of those things where it feels like, oh, this is a truly original way of exploring this, and it's not just referential to other media, which is what so much of, like, Gunbuster is. Even when it's really good, it is so heavily referential that sometimes it, you know, like, that doesn't always work for me so well. But that sequence where the choice of having it be, okay, this whole scene is in the cockpit, it's just from the main character's perspective. So you're sitting in the cockpit with Noriko, as she has absolutely no idea what the fuck is going on, right? You get these, like, weird blurred shapes of the bugs zooming past her, and you hear the Smith on the radio talking to her through the early parts of the scene, and then it goes radio silent, and she's trying to get into contact with him and just can't hear him, and she's just drifting through space, totally disoriented. I love the way that all the paneling is drawn, and there's so much thought and care that's gone into the kind of hard sci-fi conceptualizations of what kinds of instruments would this machine need to have, because it's a three-dimensional space that is having to navigate. It's not like like an airplane that, yes, can move through 3 dimensions, but fundamentally has to consider a flat plane that is its parallel, or that is a perpendicular to Earth, because that's where gravity is. In space, you don't have that. There is no flat plane on which to orient yourself, so you are truly lost in 3 dimensions. And I think the way that they depict that, it's so incredible. And also the use of color of like the really dark black space with these like bright points of stars, like the way they realize that on screen, I think it just creates this really compelling aesthetic that also puts you so in the character's mind space. And I love the commitment to, yeah, Smith fucking just gets killed entirely off screen. You don't even hear it happen. Like, yes, you don't even technically know if he has died. Like, potentially he could still be alive out there drifting in space. You have no idea. You have absolutely no concept of what happened to him. He's just gone. He did not come back. Who knows? And there's a real commitment to that idea, and such a follow through on that. And it's a very kind of brutal and harrowing story to tell. But it's one that I've not ever seen in any other mecha media take it to that level. And that, to me, is honestly my favorite part of the entirety of Gunbuster, just that whole sequence.
Well, it's a great episode, and I think, even though the title of that episode is First Love, First Sortie, what it's really about is first attraction, and it's about, like, that she is attracted to Smith. This guy's very, nice. They kind of form this friendship, and then it is just ripped away. And I think that's part of what's so harrowing about the ending when she comes back and he's gone, is, like, she didn't even get to find out if this was a love or something or whatever this could have been, right? It just vanishes. And I think that episode is very good at the part 1, part 2 split of she's been rejected by One-sama. Smith kind of seems like a jerk at first, but he's really a pretty nice guy. He leaves a big impression on us because he's voiced by Kazuki Yao, and then he's gone. And there's something about the way I think they the first half speaks to the second half of that episode that is masterful. This is probably the episode that I think is hurt worst in the movie edit because it just relies on duration, that you can't really cut it down and get the same effect. Whereas, like, you can take the big action sequence out of episode 4 and get rid of some of the context, and it still plays, because when the Gunbuster just grabs a full alien ship and crushes it between its hands, that's cool no matter what. And I do think it's great that we go from this very, like, harrowing, realistic sequence in episode 3 to, we're going to give you the biggest mecha you've ever seen, and it's going to grab an alien ship between its hands and throw it around, and it's fucking ridiculous. And that is, again, the magic of Gunbusters, that it can go... And this is also just the Anno Hideaki effect in all of his work, is it can go from the crazy ridiculous to the intimate and the harrowing and the horrific in a way that is cool. But yeah, episode 3 is interesting because it is so different from the rest of the series. I do think it anticipates things Anno will do in later works, but it's mostly not the tone of the rest of Gunbuster itself, which is not as harrowing as that.
I think one of the other things I like about episode 3 a lot, and this kind of gets into what is like my main criticism, the one thing I don't particularly love about Gunbuster, and it kind of hurts the ending for me, is that I do kind of struggle with most of the supporting cast, which I don't think ultimately are particularly interesting. Like the One-sama, like they're fine as the archetypes, right? Like the One-sama character archetype, the coach archetype, right? Like that's fine. And then Jungfreud, she's like a fun character because she's called fucking Jungfreud, like whatever. I mean, she's not much of a character in the show. Though she does exist in that kind of rival archetype that then becomes, she's the shoujo manga, she's the shoujo manga equivalent of a Vegeta, right? It's that same character exists in shoujo manga as in shonen manga, the rival that becomes a friend.
It also means that in episode 5, we get a scene where we're at Noriko's apartment, and she has her calendar, and circled on her calendar is a date that says Beach Day with Freud, and that is one of the funniest panels of any anime ever, is Beach Day with Freud. I love it. Someone make that movie, and it's a period piece about someone going out for Beach Day with Freud. It sounds great.
Yeah. But the thing I struggle with those characters is I don't think that they have a lot of, like, actually interesting narrative material connected with them. So when the show tries to do more with them, when you get to the Anno stuff, when you get to episodes 5 and 6, episode 5, it's fine. It's just, it's very melodramatic. And it honestly, like, in a weird way, episode 5, in terms of the first half of it, maybe exists the most in that Aim for the Ace in similar series kind of space, because that story, yes, it's we have all the space-time dilation shit, but the fundamental story of, like, the coach is dying from this horrible illness and he's hiding it, and the One-sama is in love with him, and there's this sort of whole love triangle, like, that's just ripped straight from those kinds of stories. It's just, backed with the potential extinction of mankind. The problem is that that melodrama, I think, is effective in the source material because they are long serialized narratives that have done a lot of complicated things with those characters through its serialization. And this is the one thing I think that Gunbuster kind of misses out on because it's a 6-part OVA, is that those elements don't get the kinds of complications that their inspirations have. Because a lot of, like, that Onesama character archetype, the thing that's interesting about that character archetype in the series that use it that I have seen is that it's there to explore this homoerotic space between the Onesama character and the protagonist. And the coach dude is there as this sort of, like, heteronormative dome to kind of, like, allow this playful kind of homoerotic narrative to take place in, you know, and that's like a maybe more sort of charitable way to say that it's queer baiting, because this kind of stuff is kind of the root of where queer baiting manga comes from. But it is also, it performs like an important function. I think there's like a reason why those stories were constructed in this way. It's very common. Like the thing I'm thinking of specifically is Dear Brother, the Dezaki Osamu series, that is from a mangaka the same manga that did Rose of Versailles and a bunch of other series like this that are all contemporary to something like Aim for the Ace, exist in the same broad sphere of a series like that. And those stories go to really interesting spaces in the detail of the melodrama of those characters that explore big ideas about social norms and homoerotic relationships and things like that. And when you strip all that away and you're just left with the character archetypes, I kind of find that fairly dull. And that's something that episode 3 gets away with, because episode 3 is able to do something that the TV show version of Gunbuster would not be able to do, because Smith was not a character that you would spend on one episode. Like, you just couldn't afford to do it. He's too important of a character in the scope of what Gunbuster is, that he wouldn't be a one-episode guy, right? Or if he was a one-episode guy, it wouldn't have the impact because he would feel disposable, because he'd be a dude who is in 1 out of 52 episodes rather than a guy who is in 1 out of 6 episodes. And so in episode 3, it uses the OVA structure to tell a story that it can only tell because of the OVA, or it can only tell the way it does because of the OVA. And I struggle with some of like 4, 5, 6 when you get into some of the stuff that's not Noriko. I think our main character is really well done, but those side characters, I sort of lost a lot of interest in them in the back part of the show. And so there's stuff in 5 and 6 in particular that just didn't particularly do a lot for me, because the underlying story about those character relationships no longer I found particularly interesting.
2 reactions to that. 1, I'm realizing now a question we had throughout our Sound Euphonium discussions last year. Why do we have the stupid plot where Reina is in love with the teacher? It's the legacy of sports anime and queer baiting.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, there we go. Okay. 2, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. And I think Gunbuster would, like, those things would probably bother me more if everything around them weren't so virtuosic. Mm-hmm. And it's like you get swept up in it and it's over fast, and I kind of love all the steps along the way. Like, I do still think, and I think, like, part of it is, you know, the character designs and the vocal performances are so good that, like, if you get the archetype right enough, I think you can still be carried through on it, and I think that works here. And I still think it's doing some things in kind of the acceleration of the story that I find very moving and cool. Like, I do really like how episode 5, you know, suddenly jumps forward, and we're back in Okinawa, and we have, like, the weird, like, surreality of the 2 characters, Onesama and Noriko, having their high school graduation 10 years after everyone else. And then you have her meeting Himiko again, and some of that stuff. And just that, like, slight displacement in time, I think, is really cool. I like that the series slows down for that half episode. And then I like everything that I think episode 6 does with that, in part because I do think it is mainly concentrated on Noriko. And I think there's this interesting thing where, like, One-sama has had to get 15 years older to kind of realize what she values in Noriko, and there's little things like that I think play very well in that final episode. But I'm not going to lie and tell you that, like, I think, you know, the side characters are the most developed thing about this show, because they're obviously not. I think, like, you know, Coach Oda works because he is Norio Wakamoto and because he has a really cool character design, and that kind of sells a lot of the other stuff, even though, is the romance between him and One-sama, like, one for the ages that I'll never forget? Of course not. But it also, you know, I think this series is adept enough at playing with the archetypes and remixing them, and everything else around it is so good that it doesn't bother me, even though I don't disagree that it is, like, technically a weakness.
Yeah. And I guess, like, here's where, like, for me, I had this moment of, like, a eureka moment watching episode 6 of where I was like, a lot of this I'm loving. Like, obviously, I love the black and white aesthetics and the fucking widescreen shit and all that is so cool. And the idea of the narrative is very fantastic and cool. And I love time dilation stories. At the same time, there was something where, like, for me, the Onesama Noriko relationship just falls very flat for me in this series for, like, some of that stuff I was just talking about, the serialization stuff, is I just found myself not caring about that character pairing in any way. And I had this moment of like, oh, Gainax is the Quentin Tarantino of anime. Like, this is the same thing I have when I watch a lot of Quentin Tarantino movies, where I get to where I love it in the moment, and I love like so many of the individual pieces because the production's so good, and I love all the stuff that it's referencing. But then there's something that when I get to the end, there's a certain hollowness I have that where I'm left with like, but what if I just watched Dear Brother? Or what if I just go watch Aim for the Ace, right? Of like where it's so sort of, it's pulling so much stuff from other places. I'm not just Aim for the Ace, because it's also pulling stuff from Space Battleship Yamato. It's pulling stuff from the Forever War. It's pulling stuff from, right? Like all the sci-fi stuff is also heavily referential, not just the sports stuff and those character archetypes. That it's like, I think there is a certain something that I wish it had that extra spark to push beyond those things. And that's the same problem I have with a lot of Quentin Tarantino movies, where I end up at the end of Kill Bill just being like, but what if I just watched Lady Snowblood? Like, what if I just watched that? And there is, I think, this very fine place when you are this kind of creator. And honestly, this is also a feeling I have with Neon Genesis Evangelion as the TV show. And this like helped me come to terms with something that I don't like about Neon Genesis Evangelion as a TV show, is it has this kind of Tarantino-like quality with its influences. And I think there's like this really fine line as a creator you have to draw when you are pulling so much and you're so obsessed with the things you're pulling things from, that you have to, there needs to be this extra spark that takes it or at least for me, that takes it this extra mile. And that spark can't just be that the production values are so good, right? Like I need like an extra kind of narrative heart there that moves it to this other place. And I think that that's what the movie versions, like the rebuild of Evangelion, does in this incredible way. But it's something that I think that this show struggles with. And so even though episode 6 has so much amazing stuff, I still was left at the end of it being like, this is cool, but I don't feel emotionally attached to what has happened to this story in any way.
I totally understand that. I think the Tarantino comparison is interesting. I think one thing that's different is that separating Gainax from Anno does eventually surpass the Tarantino-ness of himself, right? Like, I think Anno becomes Anno at a certain point, and he stops being a reference guy in a way I don't think Tarantino ever has achieved. And if anything, I think as Tarantino has tried to be more himself, I think he's a less good filmmaker. Like, I think his last couple movies are his worst couple movies, The Hateful Eight and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because I think the actual core of him as a person is pretty hollow in what he has to say. And I don't think that's true of Anno Hideaki. I think he has gotten older, he has gotten more interesting. And I think he hasn't lost any of the virtuosity of his early work, but I think time has like mellowed and humbled him in weird, just he's lived a life and he's gone through things and he's reconsidered old ideas and he's made, things like Shin Godzilla or the Shin Evangelion films that are just unbelievable. And some of his live action work too, just very virtuosic. But I think that is probably a fair comparison for some of Gainax's stuff. And I think if we're making the Tarantino comparison, I do think Gunbuster Kill Bill is probably the right reference, because Kill Bill, what I do think why Kill Bill is one of Tarantino's best movies is it is so naked with what it wears on its sleeves. It is like Tarantino. I've heard the comparison before that it's sort of like Tarantino programming a film festival, but instead of showing the movies, he's just made versions of his own. And so Kill Bill jumps wildly between all these different things. It's an anime for 10 minutes. It's Lady Snowblood for parts of it. It's, doing these like silhouette effects at different points. It's a sort of neo-Western in its second half. And I think it is virtuosic enough that you do get, even though I don't think there's a ton of depth to it by the end, it is still a very satisfying experience and I like it. And I think Gunbuster is probably in that camp in a way that I think is flattering to it, but I also see what you're saying. And I would not teach or write about Gunbuster as like a genre-defining masterpiece in its substance. I also don't need everything to be like that. Sure. Like another comparison I honestly thought of with some of the episodes here, like I think episodes 1 or 4 is Independence Day. Like I think it's like got kind of that like, this is dumb as rocks, but it's dumb as rocks done really well. And god fucking damn, is it satisfying. You know, when Will Smith punches out the alien and says, "Welcome to Earth," is that high art? Probably not. Do I cheer? Yeah, fuck yeah, I cheer. And when, you know, she gets in the big-ass stupid gunbuster, and it looks like an ancient Egyptian god turned into a machine, or it looks like if, you know, Yu-Gi-Oh! Had mecha, that's what the gunbuster looks like, and suddenly it's going out there and it's capturing ships between its hands. Oh, fuck yeah. You know, my lizard brain loves that. And I think it can, you know, that's maybe the level I enjoy it on, and it is very enjoyable on that level. I do see what you're saying. I think the very, very end of Gunbuster does get me emotionally. I think the idea of coming back to Earth, and this thing has like extended 10,000 years, and they've made this sign, but they've gotten the very last kana backwards, and that whole thing, and I think the music Tanaka plays there, because boy, Tanaka Kohei gives this series a lift in multiple, you know, big scenes. Like, I still very, very like the ending and find it very sweet. But does it have that, like, as you're saying, kind of transcendent quality where it all ties together into something deeper that I think, like, the Shin Evangelion films have? No, not yet.
Yeah, and I think there's part of it is I don't know if, like, the time dilation stuff ultimately, for me, feels particularly meaningful in the way that early on it did. Because I do think that sequence in episode 2 is fucking incredible. Like,
oh, yeah.
where they go to they're going out, there's some object that's approaching Earth at near light speeds, and, like, the whole thing of we got to plan this whole mission and we've got to, like, you know, get to near the speed of this object, and all that kind of stuff, and enter its kind of general velocity to even be able to interact with it. And then the revelation that, oh, it's the spaceship that Noriko's dad was on, that had a trajectory back towards Earth, and she, like, goes rogue and goes onto it. And, like, realizing, oh, the whole fucking bridge has been completely destroyed and it's just gone. And she screams and cries in that this is, like, the thing that cost them 6 months. And there is this sort of really powerful metaphorical cohesion there of, yes, like, her confronting this. It is this lost time, the lost time of grief she has to go through. Like, I think there are moments of this sort of, like, brilliance that's on the edges of some of the earlier episodes of Gunbuster that suggest, like, a deeper level of integration with the sci-fi concepts and the narrative that's being told with the characters. And I do think that gets, I don't think that they stop trying to do it, but I think that it gets hard for them to do it in those last couple of episodes because it goes so big, it goes so extra. And I think, like, the focus on Noriko becomes a little more vague, partially because I think the relation to the character, the Yunesama character, is so sort of thin that there's not a lot of push and pull there in that relationship dynamic to give us a lot of, like, really meaningful stuff for Noriko compared to her relationship with her father or her relationship with Smith, just in terms of that kind of the story that they tell with Smith of her failing to do what she feels like she needs to do and it costing this person's life. Like, there's a more narrative weight and substance there that's being delivered through the science fiction trappings, and that kind of stuff in episode 2 and 3 I really love. And I kind of wish that the series had kept a little bit more of that sensibility about it when it went sort of bonkers. I guess, which is what I'd say the last 3 episodes are.
I think you can feel that this series has 3 distinct writers. I think you can feel Okada, even if you don't, like, know their other work. I think you can feel that episodes 1 and 2 are written by someone different than 3 and 4, which are written by someone different than 5 and 6. Because 5 and 6 are pure uncut 1989 Anno Hideaki. Like, they're just... Yes. It is, you are putting an HDMI cable into his brain and seeing what spills out. And I think that's part of what I like about 5 and 6, because they are so off the cuff, like, firing from the hip Anno. And I think there is something electric about any time, like, a young artist gets the keys to the kingdom and goes hog wild, and I do think that's what episodes 5 and 6 feel like. But then, like, 3 and 4, I think you can feel, you know, different things going on with the what's his name, the Yamagi, the guy who wrote those ones, and you know, so there's different sensibilities that kind of come out and, like, linger in different places, and I think that's very true. I do want to just highlight what you said dramaturgically. The scene in episode 2 with the ship is fucking gangbusters. It plays so well. Like, all of the, like, the animation really sells the speed at which they're accelerating, and then the whole drama of Noriko going rogue and Coach having to get out there. Wakamoto is so good in that episode as he realizes the mistake he's made, because he didn't know what this was, and he obviously wouldn't have brought Noriko if that was the case. He just wanted to give them experience with like light speed travel. But then it's like, oh shit, I brought this girl to the site of her trauma and she does not have the maturity to deal with it right now. And then it's like, okay, what the fuck do we do? And you've got like, their watches are synced up, so it keeps cutting back to that. Like, it's just good action filmmaking. It's really good action filmmaking, and it plays really well. And the fact that they've seeded things earlier in the episode, like, because this is where young Freud gets introduced, and you have... Just love that I just said that sentence. Yes. But anyway, this is where young Freud gets introduced, and you have her saying, oh, my birthday party is next month, you guys better be there, which, of course, if you know how stories work, means they're not going to be there. But the reason they're not there, that they just barely missed it, and they missed that time. Like, it's just very good drama on that basic level of, like, how do you tell a story in 30 minutes? It's very good at that.
Yeah, because you also have the detail of that Noriko actually very rarely ever saw her dad. She only ever really saw him on her birthday.
Yes.
And so you get that extra, like, the loss of him is the loss of that birthday as well, right? There's just a lot of narrative resonance in that plot that I think it's so dense, but there's so much that happens. You know, this is you know, luckily very far away from the horrible world we were in Dragon Ball GT, where only one plot point could occur in a 30-minute episode of TV. Here it's like, yes, this is a full-blooded plot with so much thought and care that's gone into it that has this, like, very clear narrative spine. And yeah, Wakama no Norio is just incredible. Like when he says "Ikan," when he realizes, and it's basically like, oh shit, like, no, don't let her go. Like, the way he screams that and belts out that line, it's like, god damn, hell yeah, that's a dude who's got some fucking vocal cords. It's very good.
Yeah, and I think there is just a part of with the shift in writers is there is just kind of a shift in emphasis too. Episodes 1 and 2 are heavily about the father, but then that's kind of resolved, and Yamagi's episodes are more about Noriko herself and, like, her present tense issues, and then episodes 5 and 6 are about time, space, the universe, and everything. So, like, you kind of forget by the end that her dad was the starting point of this whole thing, because it does kind of get, it's not that it doesn't get expressed. I think episode 2 does a lot with it, as we're saying. So it's not like they just leave it behind and never do anything with it. But we move on to other things. But that scene is great. We already talked about episode 3. I think episode 4 is a pretty great version of the big super robot battle. It's just fun. I do love everything with the Gunbuster, and I think we just have to sing the praises of its design. It's great. I love that you get the science lesson in between 3 and 4, where they show the relative size of all the different things of, like, here's our normal mechs, here's the ship that we're on, here's the Gunbuster, and here's the aliens. And I think I like that they position that one because it's played in between 3 and 4, so that when the Gunbuster comes out, you understand the stupid scale it's operating on. And that's also a very Macross thing, because Macross has, like, the whole planets that become mechas and shit like that. So
yes, well, yeah, I do really love episode 4. I think that does have a really good story around Noriko, of her, like, finally now fully committing to the training and all the stuff with Coach. And then her making that big heroic gesture of, hey, we seemingly are fucked. I'm going to do it. I'm going to go out in the Gunbuster. Even if it's not ready, we're going to go for it. And then, like that whole then sequence afterwards where it comes out and it's got its fucking arms crossed, which is an incredibly iconic moment. It's very Master Asia from Mobile Fighter G Gundam, and I love that energy.
Oh, so Master Asia, yes.
It's great. Yeah, and then she just goes out and she completely fucks them up, and the voice actress just gets to absolutely unleash. And it's amazing. And partially because it's like you've been built up or pent up so much, right? Because Noriko is this character who's been, everyone, particularly Coach, keeps on telling us that she has this potential. He sees something in her and all this stuff, but she's been so timid in terms of any of the action stuff that her finally just sort of like letting all that go, it's so cathartic, and her just then fucking everything up and doing like super Nazuma kick and all this just absolutely bonkers shit, and ripping these crazy bug aliens that also are very good and creepy looking up. And
they do a good job with the aliens of never showing you too much, so that they always remain a little unknown and a little like eerie and kind of Lovecraftian. And I like that about it. I like that we never really know their deal, because I think that makes it more effective. One, you don't have time in 6 episodes to know their deal. This isn't going to be a Macross situation where we can devote like a core to like learning about the aliens and they're big and we're little on the table with the, all that kind of stuff, right? We can just have that they're these evil eldritch horror bugs that we have to kill. and I think that works very well.
Yeah, and they do, I believe episode 4 is where it opens with the scene with them at, like, the council room or whatever, and there's this one scientist, like, explaining the monsters, and I love their just simple explanations, like, no, like, we are like bacteria, and they are the antibodies, and they are here to kill us. Like, that's it. Like, that's, that's all it is. And I think that is, like, a really great, very evocative explanation that suggests larger ideas that I don't think that Gunbuster pays off. Like, there is this whole concept by the time you get to the end where we have destroyed the Milky Way galaxy. I mean, it's going to take, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years for the destruction of the Milky Way galaxy to take place, because gravity, like all things, must travel through space to affect things. But we destroy the fucking Milky Way galaxy. And it's like, well, maybe the bugs are right. And there's a little bit of, like, they sort of narrativise that or, like, lampshade it a little bit. I don't know if there's, like, a thoughtful exploration of that idea that ever takes place.
The captain of the ship basically says, history will judge us, we have no other choice. And I do, like, it's an issue technically, although it's, like, so stupid and silly, but it's a very 90s Anno thing, I think, because I think Eva, we've talked about this before, it gets into, like, levels of, like, science gobbledygook where it's just incomprehensible, but I'm also not sure the series is, like, fully maximally doing anything with it, and I think the rebuild movies do this better. But yeah, like, the fact that at the end we're doing space genocide is not fully reckoned with, or that, like, doesn't that mean Earth will just be destroyed eventually anyway? Okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, we have time to figure it out, I guess. That humanity did a lot in, like, the 20 years that Gunbuster, takes place in, so we're probably going to be okay, but shit.
Yes, but you can't, like, through whatever their sciencey gobbledygook is, they basically say that they have destroyed the galactic center of the Milky Way, which would be the supermassive black holes that have been destabilized or whatever, and they're just not there. And that would mean that everything would go fucking bonkers. Like, I'm not a fucking astrophysicist. I can't tell you exactly what would occur. I don't know, like, but the whole system of the Milky Way galaxy is the way it is because we have this intense gravitational center at the middle. It would be the equivalent of blowing up the sun and what happens to the planets after that. Well, they're not going to be where they are. And also, like, the distribution of the energy system is completely fucked. So there is, like, this sort of, like, I think, truly explored concept there of, are the bugs, like, the good guys, because presumably there are other aliens existing in the Milky Way galaxy that are all now gone, and we've just killed all of them for some amount of time to continue for the human race to exist. But the fact that it doesn't fully explore that idea aside, the idea is fucking awesome. And I think within the context of episode 4, and I would also put episode 5 in this, which episode 5 has a plan that obviously wreaks a lot of havoc on Earth, but it's like a cut off your leg to escape the bear trap kind of thing. Like, we gotta do it to survive, even if it's gonna hurt us, which is a much more reasonable thing than we're gonna destroy the entire galaxy in order to try to survive for some period of time. But episode 4 and episode 5, I think that conceptualization of, like, humanity is a thing that as we are advancing or whatever it is, that something in the universe is responding to us, like antibodies, and they're just out here to kill us. I just think that that's a cool idea, and it's a good enough explanation for the monsters to give it the right vibe, and to make the Gunbuster, it feel cool that the Gunbuster is smashing them up. And it's better than them having no explanation, and it's also way better than them having too much of an explanation, to have, like, for them to be too characterized, for them to be like the aliens in Space Battleship Yamato or Macross, which are full characters. You don't want to go that far because you don't have the time to go that far. So I think it's like, that is just a really great, where, threading the needle on exactly what these monsters need to be to make them evoke a bigger idea and to make them fun enemies to fight. Indeed.
Yeah. And yeah, episode 4, tons of fun. I love at the end when, she saved the day, and then we get the theme song in for the last time in the series, because it's not in episode 5 or 6 at all, and over the big kind of celebratory final scene, and then it goes into the end credits. So it winds up playing, I think, the full album version of the theme song, which is cool too. And it's a very triumphant kind of moment. And then it shifts gears more for episode 5 and 6 going in a different direction. But I love all that. In terms of the Gunbuster design itself, it's it's interesting because this show, as we said, wears its influences on its sleeves. You can see a lot of it. But I like that the Gunbuster, you can see what all kind of things they're pulling from, but there is no other mecha that looks quite like the Gunbuster. It's such a good design. It's got such an attitude. The crossed arms thing is just it's just a masterstroke that this thing comes out with its arms crossed and does that. I like the way that it gets in episode 6, the scene where she pulls its heart out and also winds up ripping open her thing to expose her breast, which Hideaki Anno. But anyway, but like that whole scene where it rips its heart out and like holds it aloft, and it's got that very expressive, like Egyptian kind of like statue stone face and all of that. And then it floats them back to Earth with its like metal rib cage exposed. I think all of that is just fantastic mecha stuff. If you like mecha designs, it's, you know, it's the good stuff.
Yeah, I think it does a good job of, like, it's clearly evoking that 70s era super robot. Like, it's very Mazinger Z sort of inspired, compared to in the 80s, you move to this much more angular design, both in Real Robot, but also the super robot stuff of the 80s gets a lot more kind of angular and sharp and cool looking.
Well, they also all get modular and they're transforming and they're doing all this,
Yes. Whereas like Gunbuster, it's a little bit more going back to basics, but it contains some more of those at the time modern elements as well. Particularly, I think the head design is very distinctive and very iconic, and it's very well done. And it just like it moves so well. Like it just looks cool in action. It has a bunch of cool moves where it's like the arms open up with these big electric pillars or whatever that stab into the enemy and blow it up, and that the last episode that comes out of the legs as well. It's all that shit's super cool.
Yeah, I love in episode 5 when they get their groove back and Noriko gives the big speech and One-sama is back on board and they do the super Inazuma kick together. That's great, Just, I can't deny my love for that kind of moment. And then, all of the stuff where it's, floating down into, because we didn't talk about this element of it, that they've taken the planet Saturn, or is it Jupiter, and put it inside the big black box thing. And so when they go into that ship, they're going into the gravity of Jupiter. It's just so silly. But I do love just watching the Gunbuster with its arms crossed floating down through Jupiter's like gas surface.
Yes, well, at some point, I think in episode 5, they're fighting around Jupiter 2, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's not until you get the science ones that are from the 90s that they did when they released the box set, that you get an explanation that's like, there's like 5 extra planets or some shit. There's like a whole crazy extra cosmology. There's like a twin star to the sun that only comes around every whatever million years. I'm like, why is all this? What is all that? Like, where did all that come from? But yes, there's something about Jupiter 2 gets blown up in episode 5, and that's part of what creates all the shit that fucks up Earth. But then yes, it's in episode 6, I think is what you're talking about, where they make the Buster Machine 3, which has Jupiter inside of it, and they compress it down to become some sort of gravity black hole bomb or some shit like that to blow up the center of the galaxy, because that's a thing that I guess you could do.
You couldn't, but it's cool.
No.
And, I like that the Gunbuster is so strong it can withstand not just the gravity of Jupiter, but the compressed gravity of Jupiter in a smaller space and all of this stuff. But it's great. The Black Hole Bomb, which is the Buster 3 machine, is a great design. And it's very clearly part of why they animate Part 6 in widescreen, is because it looks really good just at that ratio where when they do it wide across the screen to really emphasize the like horizontality of it and stuff like that. Because compositionally, like if you want to understand how you compose for different aspect ratios and you're interested in that, I really would recommend doing comparisons between the open matte version of episode 6 and the proper 2.0 to 1 version, because you can really see, because it's animation, you have to animate outside of the lines to like get the proportions right and everything, so that's how they do it. But you look at them and you see what is the kind of negative space and what are we actually drawing for the scene. And it's really effective because from the storyboards, obviously, to the layouts and everything, they compose for the widescreen frame really, really well, which is not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do in live action. It's not an easy thing to do in animation. And it is just a cool comparison to make. And I'm glad that is on the Discotheque release and that, Gainax has put this out there. There's also moments where you get to see like unfinished edges of the frame. I have some comparisons in our notes where you can see like just paper that got photographed underneath, or like notes from the layouts that still have people's handwriting on them. It's a pretty cool bonus feature. You don't tend to get to see that kind of material from behind the scenes because it was never meant to be seen by anybody, but it's a nice lesson in how these kinds of things are built.
Yes, and it's cool just because, as you say, like it's very thoughtful about using that widescreen frame purposefully. It's like, it's not a stunt. You know, it is because the scale of the action has moved to this such a huge space, and you've got this massive fleet with the giant bomb and all the fucking aliens, and it's just, it makes sense that for that you would really want to use that format. Whereas like episode 3, for instance, the action scene in episode 3 would absolutely be, I think, disastrous if it was tried to be at widescreen, because it's supposed to be so much more compact. And it's just, I think it's just like an interesting way to look at, because it's so rare that a thing changes its aspect ratio. It's like such an uncommon trick that it's cool to see something do that. So it's so much purpose.
Yeah, it's more common now with digital photography because you can do it much easier. You're not dealing with actual celluloid where you have to do stuff like this. But for the time, I mean, very new and very cool to see. And I think it also probably plays into the OVA of it that if this is the early Laserdisc days, this is also probably the early days of people watching letterboxed contents on their screens. And by that, children, I don't mean letterboxed the social media. I mean the process of taking a widescreen movie and putting black bars on the top and bottom so that you can frame it in a 4:3 television. But like clearly that would have been part of the inspiration, and like you would have an audience now sophisticated enough to understand that when we go from episode 5 to episode 6 would now have these big black bars. That's an artistic effect, not a mistake. And that's kind of a cool thing that they're playing with, obviously. Today, we get the benefit of, we don't have to have the giant, thick black bars. It just fills our TV, but that's not how it would have looked in 1989, which makes it even more of kind of a gamble that they were doing this, which is neat.
Yes, and it's obviously something that no TV studio would have ever fucking let them do. You know, they would not have been able to air that on a TV show. You need this sort of like more premium format where they can kind of get away with whatever the fuck they want, as long as people are going to buy it directly.
You also have one other widescreen moment in the series, which is the opening of episode 4, the avant title, as the Blu-ray calls it. And that's framed, eyeballing it at about 1.6 to 1. I think it's emulating 1.66 to 1, which is European widescreen, is what it's sometimes called. It's not just used in Europe, but there you go. My strong theory for why that scene is framed at 1.66 to 1 is because it is emulating Dr. Strangelove, the Kubrick movie. It is doing just all the shots because they're in like this shady boardroom, and it's like the camera is low up on the people leaning over the table, and Dr. Strangelove, you know what that was framed at? 166 to 1. And it's just like, it is so clearly like mimicking the composition of Strangelove that like it had to be in widescreen, because there's no other good reason for it, but like just the compositions, because that one also you can see the open mat, and it's just a lot of dead space above and below because they wanted to like make it claustrophobic and frame in on these people. And I just, you know, they've seen all the movies we've seen, Sean. It's great.
Yeah, that's a very good connection. I would not have made that, but that it is very similar to the war room scenes in Doctor Strangelove. Yes. I think you are right that is why it is formatted that way.
Yeah. All right. What else do you want to say about Gunbuster Aim for the Top before we start to wrap this up?
I do want, I was kind of a little bit down on some of the stuff I was saying with episode 5 and 6. So I want to shout out some of the things I liked about those episodes, because they're still very good. To be clear, like, I have some problems with them, but that's mostly because I loved so much of the first 4 episodes that it's more of like, it went down a little bit at the end for me in certain regards. But that doesn't mean I think they're bad, because episode 5 in particular, you kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but the opening section of episode 5, or like the first half of that episode, is in the same kind of broad narrative tonal space as some of the earlier things, where it's very much in Noriko's head. We're following her as she is trying to grapple with the notion that 10 years has passed for everyone else and she's back home. I think, like, I don't think the narrative sort of point of it is as stark as episode 2, but I think you get this sensibility of like the child soldiery kind of themes of a mecha thing, in the sense of like, she is now a fish out of water in her own community, and her like life has been paused, and she trying to pick that up, and everything else has moved on. Like, it still is, I think, effectively delivering that kind of tonal space. And all the stuff with her meeting Kimiko, who's now older, and she has like a little kid. That obviously that sets up that dynamic in episode 6, where the kid becomes as old as Noriko herself. Like that stuff is very effective, and I think when they play with some of the time dilation stuff and it's focused so specifically on Noriko's experience, I think it works really well. The places where it sort of drops down for me is, I think, then the drama with One-sama is just not as compelling, and it doesn't play on those elements as strongly. But you've got the scenes like Noriko in her room where we see all the posters you're talking about, where she's got the Totoro poster, she's got the Nausicaa one, there's a fucking space battleship Yamato. They're not trying to hide. They can't hide even if they're trying to. It's not like you can't tell what the references are. But you do just have this sense of like, you see these echoes of who she used to be, and now it's like, you don't get the sense that she's going to go out to the theaters to go see some retro anime, what for her would be a retro anime movie. That like whatever that person she used to be is now gone. That stuff in that first half of episodes of 5, I think, is very, very effective. And then the action is obviously still fantastic and weird, even when it gets very sort of esoteric and more experimental, like in 6, where it's the strange montage that you kind of talked about, where it's sort of sketched out, and it's sort of parts incomplete animation, but of various kinds of styles, and it's very evocative, and I think that works particularly well because otherwise it would be very exhausting to have 3 episodes in a row that all have a big action climax with the Gunbuster fighting a giant swarm of alien monstrosities, and sort of saying, we've done this twice, let's do it in this like crazy compressed format. Works really well in episode 6 and allows that to get out of the way for it to do the other narrative stuff it wants to do.
Well, it's clearly a reference to, earlier eras of limited animation, like
yes.
The Toei film Horus, Prince of the Sun famously has 2 action scenes that they were not able to finish on budget or on time, and so they are rendered as still paintings that they do zoom ins and outs on. And it's a reference to that kind of moment, but obviously Gunbuster, I don't think, ran out of time or money. I think they could have done a scene if they wanted to, but they decide, like, let's not just do the still frames, let's push it even further into abstraction and have it be, it's literal graphite on paper that
yes.
You can see the, like, streaks and that kind of thing. And I think that's cool to, like, take a thing from an era where anime was dealing with very real limitations and figuring out how to do that, and then saying, let's make those limitations and make them avant-garde art like this. And that's, that is part of Hideaki Anno's whole project, obviously, of his life and career.
Yeah, and there are some, like, clear nods to specifically, like, Dezaki Osamu's directorial style, obviously because of the aim for the Ace connection. So you do have those kind of postcard moment things of, like, the still frames that are more kind of gorgeously done, and obviously that sequence is similar to that. I really like the way they do this effect, and it's in most of the show where you've got your kind of like what in another show would be like more of like a crash zoom or something, but they do this interesting effect where like on the eyes they block out the top and bottom sections of the frame to just isolate the eyes of the characters and like focus on the expression. But instead of it just being totally blocked out, it's like early comic printed paper, right? And you've got like the dots. Like there's just a lot of little stylistic tricks like that. There are moments where you'll have a freeze frame of Noriko reacting to something, and it'll go like monochrome, and be a little bit more, not quite painterly, but it will evoke that manga kind of style. There are little like touches like that all throughout it. And there's lots of little experimental turns like that are referencing the manga style. It's referencing Dezaki's style. But it's like done really effectively. It's not just them like, it's not just a reference. It's not just them aping something. I think it's them sort of like looking at some of these techniques, understanding those techniques, and then trying to do something new with them. And that's like what that you're talking about with that montage is doing exactly that. It's understanding where those techniques came from, why they existed, partially aesthetically, but then also in budgetary reasons. And here deciding, let's evoke that and use some of those techniques for the aesthetic purposes and take it to this other level. Because obviously that's what that sequence to episode 6 was always designed to be, because it's not blocked out with the time for the actual action sequence, right? It's not an action sequence in still frames. It is an abbreviated action sequence because It is contained in an incredibly small amount of time. So that's how you can tell that it was never conceptualized to be a full thing, because the space in the episode doesn't exist for the full thing in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, I think, I love all of Gunbuster. I do think for me, 5 and 6 are my favorite, and I think it's probably because the primary level I enjoy Gunbuster on is the craft and the style, and I do think in those, it just really becomes particularly, like, out there and virtuosic. you start to really see Anno doing more of the kinds of things where it feels like something Kyoto Animation would later do that we talked a lot about, where it's like physical camera placements in the scene. And that's something that's like huge when we get to Eva. But I think there's not a ton of that in the early Gunbuster episodes. But like episode 5, I believe in the big scene where like the Space Council is talking, and it's where Coach eventually busts in his bathrobe and like gives the big idea to use a black hole bomb. There's a scene where you have like all of the characters reflected in a clock on the wall, and it's like, that's a Hideaki Anno shot. That's in Eva. That's in everything he's ever done. And I think that's the first time he uses that exact shot, and it's something that he very much loves.
Jonathan, that is actually an Ultraman shot, because that is.
Oh, you're correct. Yes.
This is where like you see the people should watch the Jisoji Akio episodes of Ultraman.
Yes.
Particularly Ultra 7, because that is where I've talked about this on the podcast before. But the thing with old Ultraman shows, if you have these like incredible directors that have to figure out a million different ways to shoot scenes of like 8 different people in a tiny little room, and they invented every single way you could shoot scenes with 8 people in a tiny room, I think is possible, just mathematically speaking, across like the 300-ish episodes of 70s Ultraman. And so like that specific shot, I'm like, yep, I know exactly where you're getting this stuff from. But he uses it so well. And the thing is that like a lot of the editing around it is not necessarily in that style. So it's like he's taking certain shot ideas that if you've watched some of those old Ultramans, like is very clearly there, but he is definitely incorporating it into an overall whole that is pretty distinct from the Ultraman stuff, other than Jisoji Akio. He's maybe aping a little bit too much from Jisoji still. People really should watch those episodes because it will unlock Anno in your brain in a way that's pretty crazy. But it is cool to see those influences and then how he is evolving them, because he is evolving them, to be clear.
Well, and this is why I did make sure to include Ultraman in my intro to Anno early on, because I haven't seen a lot of Ultraman, but you've told me about this, and I'm glad you stepped in and we talked about that, because one thing I don't want to do is I think there is sometimes in the West, in addition to like the Gundam erasure that comes into the Neon Genesis Evangelion discussion, there then becomes crediting Anno with the invention of techniques that he himself would tell you he got from people like Jisoji Akio in Ultraman. And it is important to recognize the longer lineage in which this all exists in. My point just being with episode 6 is you start seeing him really start bringing that in and like making that part of integrating those influences into his style very fulsomely at this point in the series.
Yeah, and there are obviously like most anime creators, I would imagine, by the late 80s are influenced by Ultraman, but not many of them, or almost none of them, are taking those exact kind of stylistic elements, right? Because it is still an unorthodox thing. Like it is a shot that sort of stands out and is very interesting in how it communicates the space. And I think it just takes a lot of like imagination to be able to have that influence, then integrate it into your own style and know when and how to deploy it. And that's a thing that I think Anno is always very good at. Even in this very early stage.
You definitely, Sean, should find and watch the 1998 movie he did, Love and Pop, because it is fascinating. It's his first live-action movie. It's one of the earliest, big Japanese movies done with digital cameras, and it is like so ADHD in how many shot setups it uses, but it is just every 5 seconds is the camera in a new place the camera shouldn't be, and it's like constant, just all over the movie. And it is, I was looking at it because I was wanting to find a movie to show for my intro to film class on specifically digital cinematography. And I would love to show that movie. That movie is too much about teenage sexuality, and intro students are not mature enough to talk about that yet.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But yeah, so I couldn't do that. And I think it's smart about some of what it's doing. It's dealing with girls, like finding their sexuality. It deals with a kind of unique Japanese cultural thing of the like dates set up with older men and kind of that whole culture that is part of like 90s Japan and stuff. So it would not be good for freshmen in college. Maybe if I'm teaching like a 3,000 or 4,000 level class, I would like to use it because on the level of cinematography, I love how free it is, and it's something that he is really good at, is like taking those inspirations from someone like I think what Anno sees in something like Ultraman is that like these guys, their material, restrictions were pretty high, but the creativity was so immense. And Anno always, I feel like, wants to channel that spirit in terms of like, what can we do with like the minimal amount we have? And even in something like Gunbuster that feels very lavish, I think you still get that feeling.
Absolutely, yeah. And that stuff is very exceptional. And you're right, it is more prominent in because obviously, he directed all the episodes, but it's more prominent in those last two where it feels like he kind of has a bigger hand on the wheel because he co-wrote those episodes and he just sort of takes it even further.
And they've sold 2 successful volumes of Gunbuster, and like they know they have an audience. They don't have to, if they're like, okay, we probably wouldn't have done the black and white widescreen thing on volume 1, but volume 3, we've already sold a bunch of these, we can do it. And they do it, and it's great. So yeah, anything else to say about Aim for the Top?
It's very good. It sort of also lit a fire under me that I gotta fucking watch Aim for the Ace, I mean, eventually we're gonna do our Dezaki Osamu season. Yes. I've watched a little bit of Dezaki Osamu. I feel like I need to do my... You
and I both want to, I know.
Yeah,
it's definitely, that is a contender for season 7 after we finish our Tomino season, because I think you and I both, we keep running into Dezaki in different places and going, we've got to do a deep dive. But the way we do deep dives is together on this podcast. So we've got to, jump together head first into Dezaki at some point.
Yes, and then we can watch Aim for the Ace and be like, oh man, all this stuff is like Aim for the Top. God, he's just ripping off Anno. God, this is fucking crazy.
Getting big Gunbuster vibes out of this tennis anime.
Yeah.
All right. No, I love Gunbuster. It's not perfect. I will say, after watching Dragon Ball GT earlier this season, it has reoriented my, levels of what I am willing to accept in terms of imperfections. Because what a joy it is, Sean, that the problem we're talking about is, did they use these vivid side characters well enough and not, whatever problems we were talking about back then that I'm trying to erase from my mind.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really glad we watched it. I did love it a lot. Again, I have a little bit of issues with some of like that home stretch, but that's only because I loved it so much coming into that home stretch. And it's one of those things that I had been meaning to watch forever, but it's just like kind of never quite got around to it. Because like the reason why I've seen Royal Space Force is because I wanted to watch that and then go watch Gunbuster because I was going to do the early Gainax stuff. So I bought the Blu-ray version of Royal Space Force, and I got the Blu-ray version of Nadia that I was going to get Gunbuster, and I just like slept on it forever. And then you put it on the list for the box. I'm like, great, finally, I'll go. I waited for a Discotheque Blu-ray sale. I bought the Gunbuster Blu-ray, and then I watched it, and it's fucking awesome. So yeah, I'm very, very happy that we watched it. It's cool as shit. I'm sure I'm going to watch it again. I'm definitely going to think about, whenever I want to think about luscious fucking animation in the 80s, Gunbuster will be one of the other things I think about. But Gunbuster is a very 80s anime, Jonathan, but it is not the most 80s anime. Because next week, on our grand tour, we are going to watch the most 80s ass anime ever of all time. Because next week, we are beginning our journey with The Dirty Pair, with season 1 of Dirty Pair.
Thank you.